My son pushed me off the boat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 15 miles from shore, then coldly said, "Say hello to the sharks." He turned his back and left, abandoning me to sink in the endless water. He thought the ocean would erase all traces, but I didn't disappear like he planned. When he came home, I was already sitting there in the shadows. I looked straight into his eyes and said, "I've got something for you too." And for the first time, he understood his nightmare had only just begun. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, drop a quick comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. Please note that certain details have been adjusted for storytelling purposes. Any names or settings are coincidental, but the message at the heart of this stays with you. The Pacific fog doesn't just obscure the horizon, it swallows secrets whole, and as I tightened the straps of the digital recorder against my ribs, I knew today would be the day the water tested everything I had left. The salt air in Crescent Bay always felt heavier, just before dawn, carrying the scent of low tide and diesel. I am Marcus Sterling, a 73-year-old retired Navy SEAL, with skin like cured leather and eyes that missed nothing, and as I stood on the mist-covered docks checking the lines of the Catherine Rose, I felt a familiar cold vibration in my gut that usually preceded an ambush. My boat was more than fiberglass and wood. It was named after my wife, and after 40 years of marriage, her loss in 2017 had left me with only the sea and the habits of a soldier. I meticulously checked the engine and the fuel lines moving with a methodical grace that age hadn't managed to steal. My routine was my armor. I adjusted my waterproof GPS watch, ensuring the signal was locked, and felt the weight of the professional-grade audio recorder concealed beneath my shirt. Most men my age would be thinking about the weight of their tackle box. But 30 years as a Master Chief had taught me never to enter a gray zone without a way to record the truth. I knew my son was hiding something, and the ocean has a way of forcing a man's hand. You might think 73 is too old to be dangerous. You'd be wrong. In the teams, we learned that the oldest dog in the pack is the one who knows exactly where to bite. Age hasn't slowed my mind. It has only removed the clutter of mercy for those who don't deserve it. I watched the clock on the dashboard. It was 6 a.m. Derek Sterling, 42, stepped onto the pier wearing a designer polo that cost more than a month's rent, his smile tight and never quite reaching his restless eyes. My son, an unsuccessful tech consultant who lived for the appearance of wealth rather than the substance of it, looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of rusted pilings and gray mist. He was 30 minutes late, a sign of the lack of discipline that had defined his adult life. He carried a tackle box like it was an alien artifact, avoiding my gaze as he stepped onto the deck. The physical contrast between us was a source of quiet mourning for me. I was a man of bone and grit, while he was a man of soft fabrics and desperate debt. He offered a practiced greeting that felt like a sales pitch, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for a beer from the cooler, a beer he shouldn't be drinking at this hour. I noted the frantic energy in his movements. Derek doesn't like the water, yet he had insisted on this deep-sea trip for weeks, calling it a healing retreat. I knew better. Desperation has a smell. It's metallic like old blood and cheap cologne. And Derek was reeking of it. Every time he adjusted those expensive sunglasses, I saw his reflection in the glass, a man looking for a way out of a hole he had dug with his own greed. We cast off at 6:15 a.m., the Catherine Rose clearing the harbor breakwater with a steady, confident hum. I steered with practiced ease, my hands steady on the wheel, while Derek fumbled with his drink. I watched the lighthouse of Crescent Bay disappear into the thick bank of fog, feeling a cold weight in my chest that had nothing to do with the morning air. I could sense him behind me watching my back. It wasn't the gaze of a son looking at his father. It was the predatory hunger of a man looking at an obstacle. Why do we always want to believe the best of our own flesh and blood, even when the truth is screaming in our faces? I had raised him, bailed him out of his failures, and yet I knew that the blood in his veins had curdled into something I didn't recognize. The shore was gone now, replaced by a world of endless gray and blue. I kept my eyes on the horizon, but my ears were tuned to every movement Derek made behind me. He wasn't rigging any lures. He wasn't checking the bait. He was just pacing the small deck, his loafers squeaking against the fiberglass. I reached down and subtly checked the tackle box he had brought aboard. Nestled between the lures was a small industrial-sized bottle of a clear liquid that didn't belong in a fisherman's kit. I recognized the label from my days in the service, a powerful chemical solvent, something that shouldn't be anywhere near a pleasure craft. I didn't say a word. I just kept my hand on the throttle, pushing us further out toward the deep shelf where the water drops into an indigo abyss. I had been treading carefully around Derek for months, sensing the shift in his behavior, but seeing that bottle confirmed my worst fears. My son wasn't here to fish. He was here to conduct a transaction, and I was the currency. I thought of Catherine and the home we had built, the acres of pine and history that Derek was so eager to liquidate. As the shore vanished completely, I realized Derek wasn't looking for fish. He was looking for a place where no one could hear a man scream. I increased the speed the engines roared, drowning out the silence between us as we headed for the 15-mile mark. The water was flatter than a mirror, indifferent to the betrayal brewing on the deck of my wife's namesake. I was 73 years old, and I was about to find out if the ocean had one more lesson to teach me, or if my son was about to learn exactly what a retired Master Chief is capable of when his legacy is at stake. The engine's hum changed as we hit the deep shelf, a low predatory vibration that seemed to vibrate right through my boots and into my marrow, signaling we were officially beyond the reach of any casual rescue. The shoreline was no longer a distant line of hope. It had surrendered to the curve of the earth, leaving only the vast and different expanse of the Pacific. I watched the water transition from a friendly sun-dappled turquoise to a deep bruised indigo that looked thick enough to swallow the sun. Derek sat on the bench across from the helm, nursing a lukewarm beer and staring at the GPS display as if the numbers on the screen were a countdown. He wasn't looking for fish. He wasn't even looking at the horizon. He was looking for a threshold, a specific coordinate where the law of the land finally loses its grip. I kept my hand steady on the wheel of the Catherine Rose, but my mind was in tactical overdrive. I knew my son was drowning in a sea of debt, but I hadn't realized until this very moment how far he was willing to swim to get out of it. He dropped a bombshell that hit harder than any rogue wave. He'd already signed a preliminary intent to sell agreement with Meridian Development. He had effectively sold the Sterling Estate, my home, the 4.2 acres of history and pine needles Catherine and I had cultivated for 4 decades before I was even in the ground. It was the ultimate betrayal of the bloodline, a transaction made in the shadows of my own life. We reached the 10-mile mark, and the silence between us became a physical weight. I remember Derek at 10 years old, how he used to love the deep water, clinging to the railing with wide-eyed wonder. I asked him what had changed since then, why he couldn't just enjoy the salt air anymore. He didn't look up from his beer when he told me he'd grown up, and realized that staring at a bobber doesn't pay the bills. It was a cold transactional answer that confirmed my morning. I wasn't just losing my land. I was losing the memory of the boy I thought I knew. The ocean at 15 miles isn't a playground. It's a blue desert that doesn't care if you're thirsty or if your heart is breaking. It is a place of absolute clarity where only the strong or the desperate survive. And as I looked at my son, I saw a man who had become both and neither. He was desperate enough to be dangerous, but too weak to be honorable. As we hit the 12-mile mark, Derek finally dropped the facade. He stood up, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and pulled a damp folder of documents from his designer bag. He slammed them onto the navigation table, the metallic smell of the Meridian documents ink cutting through the salt air. He told me they had upped the offer to $3.8 million. He called it life-changing money. He asked me why I was clinging to a pile of old wood and pine needles when we could be living like kings. I looked at him, feeling the scorching heat of the midday sun on my neck, and told him that those pine needles were planted by his mother's hands. I told him that some things don't have a market value because they are the only things that give value to a life. He didn't want to hear about Catherine. He didn't want to hear about legacy. He wanted a signature. Have you ever looked at someone you raised and realized you were staring at a total stranger? It's a special kind of death. It's a hollow, echoing grief that starts in the center of your chest and radiates outward until your very bones feel like they're made of ash. By the time the GPS ticked over to 15 miles, the heat was oppressive, a physical weight on my shoulders that made the air feel thin. This was the threshold I had chosen, the limit of most shore-based radio signals. The world felt silent, reduced to the rhythmic slap of indigo water against the hull and the low thrum of the engine. Derek's desperation finally turned into a shrill, ugly anger. He mocked my military pride, calling my service a relic of a dead world, and the Sterling Estate, a shackle that was dragging the whole family into the dirt. He screamed that I was being selfish, choosing a ghost over my living son. I stood my ground, my voice calm, but as sharp as a combat knife, telling him that I was choosing honor over greed. I was choosing the woman I loved over the man he had become. The bitter, dry taste of adrenaline was thick in my mouth, a familiar sensation that told me the talking was over. Heat, indigo water, a son's scream. The world was narrowing down to a single violent point. I saw the boat's wake cutting through the bruised water, like a scar, a trail of white foam, leading back to a life that was already ending. I reached for my water bottle, but as I did, I caught a scent that stopped me cold. It didn't smell like beer. It was a chemical medicinal odor, faintly metallic and dangerously familiar. I glanced at the bottle Derek was drinking from, and realized it smelled exactly like the solvent I'd found in his tackle box earlier. He wasn't just drinking to take the edge off. He was intoxicating himself, chemically tempering his nerves to find the courage for what came next. He was a coward trying to manufacture the heart of a killer. The engine's pitch dropped as I throttled down, the sudden quiet making the air even heavier. I watched Derek's hands. They were shaking, but his eyes were fixed on the iron gaff in the rack beside him. He looked like he was about to jump out of his own skin, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. Derek leaned over the side, but he wasn't looking at the water. He was looking at the heavy iron gaff in the rack, and his hand was shaking with a desperate, murderous intent. There is a specific kind of silence that precedes a storm, a heavy, airless vacuum where the only sound is the frantic pounding of a liar's heart and the slow, steady breathing of a man who has seen too much war. I stood at the helm of the Catherine Rose, watching the 15-mile marker tick over on the GPS. Derek was still staring at the iron gaff, his hand hovering over the metal hook, with a trembling indecision that made my skin crawl. The air was stagnant heavy with the smell of stale beer and sun-baked salt pressing down on us like a physical weight. My son finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and desperate, and the dam of his composure finally broke. He didn't just reveal a mistake. He confessed to a slow-motion suicide. He was $185,000 deep in a failed tech startup, a vanity project that had bled him dry, but that wasn't the worst of it. The staggering gambling debts to men who didn't accept apologies or payment plans were the true anchor dragging him under. He told me that Vanessa had been the one to suggest this fishing trip, framing it as a healing retreat to bridge the distance between us. I felt a cold prickle of tactical alarm. Vanessa had always been the architect of his ambitions, and if she was the one who had mapped out this day, then we weren't just fishing. We were participating in a script she had written in the dark. I listened to his pleading with a detachment I had learned in the mud of foreign jungles. He begged me to sell the estate, to sign the Meridian papers, and trade the dirt of my home for his survival. He asked if I wanted my grandson Thomas to be homeless because of a few old trees. I looked at him and saw the same patterns I'd seen in 100 chronic addicts over the years. Men who would burn their own houses down, just for the warmth of the fire. I told him I had bailed him out twice before thinking I was buying him a future, but I realize now I was just funding his funeral. Is it possible to hear the exact moment a bond of blood snaps? Or is it a silent fracture deep beneath the surface? Until the whole structure collapses, I could feel the microscopic tears in our relationship finally giving way. Derek wasn't my son in that moment. He was a liability in the field, a compromised asset that was threatening the mission of my life. I stood firm, describing the spiritual weight of the property he was so eager to liquidate. I spoke of the pine grove Catherine had planted with her own hands, of the sanctuary that land represented for our family. Derek didn't just disagree, he sneered. He called the Sterling estate a corpse shrine, a morbid monument to a dead woman that was strangling the living. The resentment in his voice was a jagged thing honed by years of feeling second best to a ghost. He accused me of loving Catherine more than I loved him. He was a drowning man, but he wasn't reaching for a hand. He was trying to use my head as a stepping stone to keep his own chin above the rising tide of his debt. I watched a bead of sweat track down his motionless face, the humidity of the afternoon making every breath feel like a struggle. The low vibrating growl of the idling boat engine seemed to mock the chaos of his emotions. He was waiting for me to break to offer him the salvation of my signature, but he didn't understand the man he was dealing with. I don't break, I endure. We were 15 miles out, precisely where I wanted to be. The sun glinted off the gaff's metal hook with a blinding intensity that made me squint. I looked Derek in the eye, my voice as flat and unyielding as the horizon. I told him that the house wasn't just wood and soil, it was 40 years of honor. I told him his mother's soul was in that ground, and as long as I was alive, that house would stand. Not 1 acre would be sold, not 1 tree would be felled. The air on the boat seemed to freeze in the wake of my decree. Derek's hands, which had been shaking with a palsy of fear and chemical influence, suddenly went still. The shrill, ugly anger died out of his eyes, replaced by a terrifying, hollow calm. It was the cold clarity of a man who had found a loophole in a dead-end sentence, a man who had just realized that the only thing standing between him and $3 million was my heartbeat. Mark my words, the most dangerous person in the world isn't the one with a gun. It's the one who has convinced themselves that their cruelty is actually a form of survival. I sensed the shift in the atmosphere instantly. My training doesn't fail me even after all these years. I watched his fingers flex, no longer trembling, but finding their grip. The gaff was still in the rack, but Derek was no longer looking at it with hesitation. He was calculating the distance between us, the angle of the deck, and the speed of the current. The man who had been whining about debt moments ago had vanished, replaced by something much simpler and much more lethal. A predator. He was looking at me, but he wasn't seeing his father. He was seeing a side of beef, an obstacle to be cleared, a transaction to be finalized. I felt the adrenaline sharpen my vision, making the world high definition. I knew what was coming. I had spent my life preparing for ambushes in the dark, but I never thought the enemy would be wearing my own name. The look Derek gave me wasn't one of anger anymore. It was the look a butcher gives a side of beef, calculating, cold, and entirely finished with the living part of the transaction. Violence is rarely like the movies. It doesn't wait for a dramatic swell in music or a clever one-liner. It just happens in the space between a heartbeat and a breath. I stood there on the deck of the Catherine Rose, watching the man I had raised look at me with the clinical detachment of a butcher. My skin prickled with a warning I had felt in dozen combat zones, that static charge in the air before a terminal strike. I shifted my weight, intending to reach for a water bottle to buy a second of observation, but Derek didn't wait. He lunged. It wasn't a clumsy stumble. It was a desperate, full-bodied shove, fueled by years of resentment and the looming shadow of his debts. He caught me mid-turn, his younger, heavier frame colliding with my 73-year-old shoulders with the force of a sledgehammer. I felt the rough, sun-beaten fiberglass of the gunnel scrape across my ribs, a sharp bite of pain that was quickly eclipsed by the terrifying sensation of gravity vanishing. The deck tilted away from my boots, replaced by the white-hot glare of the midday sun, and then a plummeting descent into the dark indigo deep. The world flipped, blue sky trading places with foam-flecked water, and then came the impact. The Pacific didn't greet me, it assaulted me. The water was a bone-chilling shock, a liquid vice that slammed the air from my lungs the moment I broke the surface. I went deep, the bubbles roaring in my ears like 1,000 angry voices before my instincts took over. I kicked, fighting the drag of my clothes, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. As I broke the surface, gasping and sputtering, I reached out for the boat, expecting to see a hand, a life ring, or even a panicked face. Instead, I saw Derek standing at the railing, looking down at me with an expression so terrifyingly blank it made the freezing water feel warm by comparison. I realized then that the trap hadn't just been set today. He had disabled the emergency ladder and the swim platform release before we even left the harbor. He had turned my own sanctuary into a floating coffin. I clawed at the slick hole, my fingers finding no purchase on the polished gel coat. "I'm sorry, Dad," Derek said, his voice carrying over the slap of the waves with a chilling hollow resonance, "but you're just in the way. Impact, cold, darkness. The ocean doesn't welcome you, it accepts you like a grave." I watched him turn away from the rail, his movements calm and methodical, as if he were simply finishing a day's work at the office. I treaded water, my joints already beginning to stiffen from the thermal shock. The salt water burned my eyes and stung the back of my throat, a bitter, oily taste of diesel exhaust lingering on my tongue. I watched Derek walk back to the helm, his posture straight, no longer the trembling wreck who had boarded the boat in the harbor. He looked out at the horizon, ignoring my frantic splashes. Then he paused. He looked back over his shoulder one last time, his eyes meeting mine, for a final silent verdict. "Say hello to the sharks, Dad," he called out. It wasn't a scream, it was a promise. He turned the key, and the twin engines of the Catherine Rose roared to life. The sound was a physical vibration that traveled through the water and deep into my chest, a mechanical growl that signaled the end of my life as Marcus Sterling. How do you reconcile the man who taught you to ride a bike with the monster currently watching you drown? There is no logic for it, no tactical map that can navigate the betrayal of a son. I watched the stern of the boat lift as he throttled up the propellers, churning the water into a boiling white froth that threatened to pull me under their blades. The boat carved a wide, arrogant arc away from me, the hull slicing through the swells with a predatory efficiency. I screamed his name. my voice a jagged ruin that tore at my throat, but the roar of the engines swallowed my pleas. Within seconds, the gap between us widened. 10 yards, 50 yards, 100. I watched the name Catherine Rose, the name of the woman who would have died to protect him, flicker in the sunlight before it began to shrink. The white foam of the wake was a fading scar on the indigo surface, a trail of breadcrumbs leading back to a world I was no longer a part of. Derek didn't look back. He kept the bow pointed toward the distant, invisible shore, leaving me in the center of a blue desert. The boat was a white splinter on a blue canvas, shrinking until it was just a memory of safety in a world of endless indigo. I felt a sudden sharp object brush against my leg. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in my gut. But when I reached down, my fingers brushed against the handle of the iron gaff. He hadn't just left me, he had tossed the gaff into the water near me. It was a final cruel joke, a tool to fend off predators, or perhaps just a reminder of the violence he was capable of. The silence that followed the engine's departure was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The roar faded to a hum, then a buzz, then nothing, but the indifferent rhythmic slap of waves against my ears. I was alone. The horizon was a perfect unbroken line where the bruised sky met the bruised water, offering no landmark and no hope. I looked down at my wrist, the waterproof GPS watch, still ticking a digital heartbeat in a world of salt water and silence. I reached into my shirt, feeling the hard square of the recorder still strapped to my ribs. It was still there, a silent witness to the murder Derek thought he had just completed. I was 73 years old, 15 miles from land with no life vest, and a heart full of salt. And for the first time in my life, I felt the vast dark weight of the ocean looking back at me. The sunlight was a mocking spotlight on my execution, dancing on the ripples that were slowly, patiently pulling the warmth from my blood. Panic is a physical entity, a cold, oily hand that slides down your throat and squeezes your lungs until you're willing to trade your soul for a single frantic gasp of air. As the white hull of the Catherine Rose vanished into the mist, leaving me suspended in a bruising indigo infinity, that hand began to tighten. I was 73 years old, 15 miles from land, with no life vest and a heart full of salt. And for the first time in my life, I felt the vast dark weight of the ocean looking back at me. My breathing became a series of ragged, shallow hitches that did nothing to oxygenate my blood. The sheer scale of the Pacific was a crushing revelation. I was a speck of dust on a liquid desert, and the silence Derek had left behind was louder than any explosion I had survived in the teams. I felt the initial wave of terror threaten to pull my head beneath the swells, my limbs turning to lead as the adrenaline spiked and then soured in my veins. Then I heard it. It wasn't a voice from the sky, but a gravelly sharp bark from the deep recesses of my memory. It was the voice of Master Chief Miller, a man who had forged seals out of raw clay 40 years ago. Panic ends more lives than bullets, Sterling. Get your head right. The mental phantom of the Master Chief didn't offer comfort. He offered discipline. I forced myself to stop thrashing. I closed my eyes against the stinging brine and initiated the BUD/S box breathing rhythm I had practiced until it was as natural as a heartbeat. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. Hold for 4. I repeated the cycle over and over, forcing the erratic thwack of my heart in my ears to subside into a tactical hum. I commanded the machine that was my body to obey. 4 in, hold. 4 out, hold. Control the machine. Slowly the world stopped spinning, and the cold hand at my throat loosened its grip. Stop. Breathe. If you fight the ocean, you drown. If you flow with it, you might just live long enough to kill the man who put you here. My mind began to clear, shedding the skin of a victim and re-armoring itself with the logic of a survivor. I realized with a sudden sharp clarity that the persistent dizziness and tremors I'd experienced over the last few months weren't signs of old age. My dizziness almost made me skip this trip, a fact Derek had counted on. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had been poisoned. The health decline Derek had been lamenting to the neighbors was a manufactured script designed to make me too weak to fight back when the time came for the shove. The betrayal was deeper than the water beneath me, a long-term liquidation of my life. But Derek had made one fatal mistake. He thought the poison had finished the job before I hit the water. He didn't know that my resolve was a substance the human body doesn't digest. I began a methodical tactical assessment. I reached down and checked my wrist. The sunlight reflected off the face of my waterproof GPS watch. The digital display was still active, a glowing, mocking reminder of exactly how far I was from the safety of the harbor. 15 miles? 1 minute at a time, I whispered to the empty air. I reached inside my soaked shirt, my fingers fumbling with the straps of the chest harness. The professional audio recorder was still there, secured tightly against my ribs. I felt the seal tracing the edges of the waterproof housing. It was intact. The realization sent a spark of cold fire through my gut. You're still recording, aren't you? Tell the truth for me. If I died here, I was just a body. If I lived, I was carrying the documented evidence of a murder attempt. I was no longer just treading water. I was a courier of the truth. Have you ever felt 2,000 feet of nothingness beneath your toes? It's a weightless horror that makes the sun feel like a spotlight on your execution. The realization of the depth was a constant nagging pressure. Every time my feet brushed against nothing, the primal part of my brain screamed about the abyss. I looked at the horizon, calculating the angle of the sun. The North Pacific Current was moving, and I was moving with it. I was a veteran of the water, and I knew the math of survival. My clothes, however, were becoming an anchor. The denim of my jeans was heavy with salt water pulling at my hips, while my work boots felt like twin blocks of lead tied to my ankles. Weight is death. Travel light or don't travel at all. I knew I had to shed the weight if I wanted to see the next hour. I tried the old military trick, first attempting to blow air into the legs of my jeans to create a makeshift flotation device. I fumbled with the denim, but the fabric was too saturated, the seams leaking air as fast as I could trap it. It was a humbling failure of theory against the reality of a cold ocean. I made the hard choice. I reached down, my fingers numbing in the heavy chill, and unlaced my boots. I watched them flutter downward, turning over and over like blue and brown ghosts as they disappeared into the 2,000-foot abyss. My boots didn't just sink, they retreated. They were smart enough to leave a fight they knew they couldn't win. As I prepared to remove my jeans, I carefully adjusted the chest harness beneath my soaked shirt. I threaded the straps back through my arms, ensuring the recorder stayed secure against my ribs. The waterproof seal was intact. Weight is death, but this weight was my witness. Next came the jeans, a frantic struggle of treading water while kicking out of the heavy denim. I let them go, watching them vanish into the indigo dark. Goodbye, Catherine. I'm not coming to join you just yet. I was vulnerable now, reduced to my shirt and underwear, but I was lighter. I was a leaner machine. Lighter now, I turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign of hope, but all I found was the first dark triangular dorsal fin cutting through the silver ripples 100 yards away. It moved with a terrifying, effortless grace, slicing the water in a steady arc that was tightening around my position. The sight of it didn't trigger a new wave of panic. Instead, it triggered a lethal pragmatism. The ocean had decided to raise the stakes, and the hunter was finally here to see what was left of the man on the surface. A shark doesn't see a decorated veteran or a grieving father. It sees a calorie count struggling in the medium it calls home. And I had exactly 3 seconds to decide if I was going to be a meal or a survivor. The triangular dorsal fin was a dark, jagged blade cutting through the silver ripples just 100 yards away. My heart, already strained by the cold and the shock of betrayal, hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't thrash. I didn't scream. In the teams, we were taught that the ocean is a mirror. It reflects exactly the amount of panic you bring to it. I forced my limbs into a state of rigid, suspended animation, treading water with the smallest, most efficient movements possible. I kept my eyes locked on that moving point, rotating my body slowly to ensure it never left my field of vision. It was a blue shark, I realized, noting the slender profile and the indigo hue of its back as it banked. It was curious, not yet committed to a kill, likely drawn in by the same scent that had alerted me earlier. I realized then that the shark wasn't circling me by accident. It was attracted to the fishing gaff Derek had tossed overboard, which was trailing a faint, oily scent of old fish blood from the morning's bait. My son hadn't just left me to drown, he'd left a dinner bell ringing right next to my head. Silence. Then the fin dipped. The Pacific became a mirror again, but I knew the monster was still down there, watching my toes dance in the dark. I waited, counting the heartbeats in the silence of the deep. 1 minute passed, then 2. The predator had found the gaff, or perhaps it had simply decided I wasn't worth the effort of a strike. Whatever the reason, the immediate shadow beneath me dissipated back into the lightless depths of the shelf. I exhaled a long, shuddering breath that tasted of salt and adrenaline. I couldn't stay here. Staying meant waiting for the cold to shut down my organs, or for the next shadow to be less indecisive. "Not today, you beautiful bastard," I whispered to the empty air. Keep moving, eye contact, no splashing, don't be prey. I needed a heading, I needed a mission. Without a target, a man in the water is just flotsam waiting for the tide to decide his fate. I licked my finger and held it high above the swells, a trick as old as sailing itself. The evaporating moisture cooled the skin on the windward side, confirming a faint but steady southeast breeze. I looked at the sun, observing its slight descent toward the west. The math was simple but brutal. Shore was 15 miles of impossible effort against a receding tide, but the main shipping lane, the liquid highway for container ships heading to Seattle, was roughly 5 miles to the northwest. If I could reach that corridor, I had a chance. The ocean is just another map. I told myself, my voice raspy and dry. I just need to read the lines. Currents moving northwest. The lane is there. It has to be. I wasn't just a man anymore. I was a navigator. You learn 2 things in BUD/S, how to suffer and how to navigate. In the middle of the ocean, one without the other is just a slow way to drown. I established my survival rhythm, a pace born of decades of endurance training. 15 minutes of slow, efficient breaststroke, keeping my head low and my movement smooth to conserve every ounce of metabolic heat, followed by 5 minutes of floating on my back to rest my shoulders. I focused on the form, the repetitive splashing sound of the breaststroke becoming a hypnotic mantra. Stroke, glide, breathe, for Catherine. I turned the physical agony of my aging joints into a fuel, a rhythmic tribute to the woman, whose name was currently being piloted back to shore by a murderer. Thirst began to set in a dry sandpaper feeling at the back of his throat that made every swallow a chore. Thirst is a slow-burning fire. It doesn't roar. It just quietly chars your vocal cords until your own name sounds like a stranger's cough. I ignored the flame. I had a waypoint to hit. As the second hour began, I checked my wrist again. The glare of the sun dancing on the waves made the digital face hard to read, but I focused until the numbers snapped into clarity. It was then that I remembered the true value of the tool I was wearing. This wasn't just a clock. During my routine patrols months ago, I had preset a waypoint for the deep water shipping lane buoy, a habit of a man who liked to know exactly where the safety zones were. I pressed the side button, my heart skipping a beat as the small compass needle flickered to life. The battery was low, drained by the water and the cold, but it was there. I had a literal digital compass to my salvation. It was a tether to reality, a glowing green line in a world of blue chaos. If the battery held for just a few more hours, I wouldn't be swimming blindly into the dark. The rhythm was working, the pain was manageable, but the physical toll was undeniable. My skin was pruned and pale, the salt beginning to itch and burn in the creases of my joints. I kept my eyes on the northwest, moving toward the invisible line, where the giant steel ships carved their way through the sea. I was a speck, a grain of sand, but I was a moving grain of sand. Then the sun caught something metallic, floating half a mile ahead. Something that didn't belong in the deep blue. It was a flash of silver, sharp and unnatural against the rolling swells. It wasn't the fin of a shark or the white cap of a wave. It was solid, catching the light, with a rhythmic pulse that matched the movement of the water. I squinted, my salt-burned eyes struggling to resolve the shape. It was too small for a boat, too large for a piece of trash. I shifted my heading, my tired muscles screaming at the change in direction, and began the long crawl toward the glint. The mind is a treacherous ally when the body is dying. It begins to weave tapestries of comfort out of the threads of agony, and I knew if I closed my eyes to embrace the warmth, I would never open them again. I focused all my remaining strength on the closing of the distance between myself and that mysterious metallic glint. Every stroke was a battle against the leaden weight of my own limbs. My heart felt erratic, skipping beats in a way that had nothing to do with the rhythm of my swim. I realized then that the dizziness I'd felt earlier wasn't just the initial poisoning from Derek's hand. He had been playing a longer game than I'd imagined. Derek had actually replaced my high blood pressure medication with a placebo weeks ago, ensuring my cardiovascular system would be primed for failure under the exact kind of stress I was experiencing now. He didn't just want me to drown. He wanted my heart to explode in the effort to stay afloat. I finally reached the object, my fingers scraping against cold, unforgiving metal. It wasn't a shipping buoy or a life ring. It was a discarded 55-gallon oil drum, a rusted relic of industrial waste floating in the deep blue. The disappointment was a physical blow, more crushing than the swell of the waves. I clung to the barnacle-encrusted rim, my palms bleeding as I tried to find a grip. The drum was slick with a toxic residue that smelled of rusted iron and old oil, a nauseating stench that made my stomach churn. I looked at the hunk of junk and let out a raspy, salt-burned laugh. Just a piece of junk, I whispered. Like me, right, Derek? I wanted to stay there to let the drum carry my weight, but the petroleum fumes were making my head swim. Move, I commanded myself. If you stay here, you're just part of the trash. I pushed away from the rusted cylinder, feeling the vast emptiness of the Pacific reclaim me. Irony is a rusted drum in a blue desert. It offers rest, then tries to poison you with the ghost of the industrial world. By 3:15 p.m., the sun was a relentless hammer, and the salt had crusted over my eyes until the horizon began to shimmer and bleed. That was when I saw her. Catherine was sitting on the water a few yards ahead, looking exactly as she had on our porch in Crescent Bay back in 2017. She was radiant, her white sundress caught in a breeze. I couldn't feel her hair a halo of gold in the afternoon light. I knew it was a hallucination, a fever dream born of heat stroke and a failing heart, but I didn't care. I see you, Kath. I croaked, my voice a jagged ruin. I'm coming home. She didn't speak, but she smiled that quiet, knowing smile and gestured toward the northwest. She became my pacer, a shimmering ghost that moved with an effortless grace just beyond my reach. I matched my strokes to the imagined rhythm of her breath, using the vision to block out the screaming protests of my muscles. Why is it that when we are closest to the end, we finally see the things that truly mattered? Is the soul just waiting for the body to get out of the way? I followed her, a dying man chasing a memory through an indigo wasteland. The comfort of the dreaming was shattered by a scream of pure electric agony that was entirely my own. A man-o'-war jellyfish. A translucent nightmare of trailing blue fire had drifted directly into my path, its long tentacles wrapped around my lead arm like barbed wire. The sting was 1,000 white-hot needles injecting neurotoxins into my bloodstream. My arm became a pillar of fire, the muscles seizing with a violence that pulled me under. I swallowed a mouthful of bitter salt water, the suffocating taste of the ocean filling my lungs as I sank into the dark. I thrashed upward, my vision tunneling as the paralysis began to creep toward my shoulder. The jellyfish sting wasn't just pain, it was a reboot. A violent electric jolt from the ocean, telling me that the dreaming was over and the dying had begun. Fight the fire, I roared internally. Breathe. Don't let it end like this. One more stroke, just one more. I surfaced gasping for air, my left arm hanging useless at my side. I was at my lowest physical point, barely conscious, my head dipping below the waves with every passing swell. I looked down at my wrist one last time, my eyes struggling to focus on the fading display of the GPS watch. The battery was at 1%, the screen flickering like a dying candle. But in its final pulse of life, it showed something that shouldn't have been there. A massive metallic signature was moving directly toward my coordinates. It wasn't a hallucination. The digital brain of the watch had locked onto a physical mass. I felt a low-frequency vibration through the water, a deep thrum that rattled my teeth. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the waves. It was the rhythmic heavy heart of a diesel engine. I tried to lift my head to scream, but my throat was a desert. My arm was a pillar of fire. My lungs were burning with salt. And as my head dipped below the surface for the third time, I heard a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the waves, the deep, rhythmic thrum of a diesel heart. The sound grew louder, a mechanical roar that promised a world of steel and safety. I was sinking, the indigo water closing over my face, but that sound anchored me to the living. I was a Navy SEAL Master Chief, and I had spent my life hunting the things that went bump in the night. Now something was hunting me, and for the first time in this long blue nightmare, I prayed it was human. The vibration was a physical pressure, now a promise of salvation, or a swift end under a massive bow. I reached up with my good arm, a final desperate clawing at the sky before the darkness finally took me. The hull of the Sea Wanderer loomed over me like a rusted iron cliff, its massive shadow promising either a swift crushing death or the miracle I had stopped praying for 3 hours ago. The deep rhythmic thrum of the diesel heart was no longer a vibration in the water. It was a physical assault on my senses, a roar that signaled the end of my long indigo nightmare. My vision was a salt-caked haze tunneling into a pinprick of light, but I forced my good arm into the air. I waved it in a frantic rhythmic arc, fighting the creeping paralysis of the jellyfish sting that had turned my left side into a useless weight. I tried to scream to give voice to the desperation clawing at my throat, but only a dry, rattling croak escaped my parched lips. "Don't look away," I pleaded silently, my lungs burning with every shallow hitch of breath. Please don't look away. I saw the towering bow of the trawler, cutting through the swells, a wall of steel that seemed indifferent to the speck of humanity bobbing in its path. Just as I felt my legs finally give out, the pitch of the engine shifted. The roar deep in the bow began to swing, and I knew with a shock of adrenaline that cut through the exhaustion that they had seen me. The rope hit the water. It wasn't just hemp and nylon. It was a tether back to the world of the living. An orange life preserver splashed down just inches from my face, bobbing on the restless surface like a beacon. I lunged for it, my fingers clawing at the rough surface with the primal strength of a dying man. Above me, silhouetted against the dying afternoon sun, a figure appeared at the railing. Captain Ray, a weathered seaman, with a beard like steel wool, and eyes that had seen 1,000 storms, stood at the helm of the Sea Wanderer with a calm, commanding presence. He didn't waste words. "I gotcha, old-timer. Hang on!" he barked, his voice carrying over the engine's growl. I felt the rope go taut as Ray and his deckhand began to haul me toward the rusted hull. My body was a dead weight, salt-scoured and shivering, but I didn't let go. As I reached the side, strong, calloused hands reached down, grabbing me under the armpits and dragging me over the gunwale. I tumbled onto the deck, the impact of solid wood and metal against my skin, the most beautiful sensation I had ever known. I lay there for a long time, my face pressed against the vibrating deck plates, gasping for air that didn't taste of salt. The smell of diesel fuel and old fish scales filled my nostrils, a perfume of survival. Captain Ray knelt beside me, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he checked my vitals. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, you're a miracle or a very stubborn ghost," he muttered, his eyes scanning the ruin of my salt-burned skin. As he moved his hands over my shoulder, he paused, his brow furrowing. I felt a sharp sting. Ray pulled back, holding a small, jagged piece of fiberglass between his thumb and forefinger. It had been embedded deep in the muscle of my shoulder, a fragment of the Catherine Rose's gunwale. He looked at the fragment, then back at me, his eyes sharpening with intuition. "This wasn't a clean fall, old man. Someone put some muscle into this." The betrayal felt fresh again, a cold fire in my chest. Derek hadn't just pushed me. He had used a tool to ensure I went over with enough force to incapacitate me. You never truly appreciate the feeling of solid ground, or even a vibrating wooden deck, until you've spent 5 hours treading water over a 2,000-foot grave. Ray disappeared for a moment and returned with a heavy, scratchy Navy-issue deck jacket. He wrapped it around my shivering frame, the wool coarse against my raw skin. He forced a bottle of lukewarm water into my hands. "Drink slow, partner," he advised. "You've got enough salt in you to cure a ham." I took a sip, the liquid hitting my parched throat like a revelation. The water Ray gave me tasted like liquid starlight. It burned the salt out of my throat and lit a fire of vengeance back in my belly. My seal brain, long dormant under the pressure of survival, began to reboot. I felt the hard square of the audio recorder against my ribs, still strapped tight. It was still there, still warm. A silent witness to the crime my son thought the ocean had swallowed. My son. I croaked out my voice, a jagged ruin. "He's at the marina?" Ray nodded, his expression darkening. "We'll get you to the Coast Guard station, Marcus. They'll have him in cuffs before the sun is down." I looked at the horizon, watching the distant line of the coast. If I went to the authorities now, the sirens would start. Derek would hear them coming. He'd have hours to destroy the documents, to burn the contracts, to hide the poisoning evidence I now suspected was in the house. He'd play the grieving son, the victim of a tragic accident, and he'd bury the truth along with my empty coffin. I couldn't let that happen. To finish this, I needed the element of surprise. I needed to be a ghost for just a little while longer. I needed to arrive when he was celebrating, when the mask was off and the greed was loud. I looked Ray in the eye, my voice a jagged ruin of its former self, and told the first of many lies that would eventually lead my son to a prison cell. "Ray," I whispered, clutching his sleeve, "don't call it in, not yet. I don't want the sirens. I want to go home quietly." He looked at me, the confusion clear on his weathered face, but I saw the respect for a fellow veteran in his gaze. I told him a story about wanting to handle it within the family first. It was a tactical deception. I needed him to drop me off at the old fuel dock far from the main marina. Ray sighed, looking out at the dark water, but he finally nodded. "I'll take you to the cove, Master Chief, but you owe me the full story when this is over." I sank back against the jacket, the diesel heart of the boat beating in sync with my own resolve. The hunt was no longer about staying afloat. It was about coming home. To destroy a monster, you first have to become a ghost, fading into the background until the world forgets you ever breathed, all while you watch the person you loved most dance on your empty grave. I sat in the dim wheelhouse of the Sea Wanderer, the scratchy wool of Captain Ray's navy jacket biting into my raw, salt-scoured skin. My voice was a jagged ruin, but I had a mission to execute. I wove a plausible lie for Ray, spinning a tale of a rogue wave that had slammed into the Catherine Rose while I was checking a stalled engine, and Derek was distracted at the helm. I feigned a foggy memory and a deep state of shock, insisting that I needed a quiet place to collect my thoughts before facing the flashing lights of the authorities. Ray was a good man, but he was a sailor first. He looked at my sunken eyes and my trembling hands and saw a vulnerable elder broken by the sea. The debt of our shared service did the rest. He agreed to my odd request to be dropped at a desolate, rotting fuel pier miles from the main harbor. My boy, he'll be out of his mind, I whispered, leaning into the role. I can't face the cameras yet, Ray. Just drop me at the old fuel dock. The sea does strange things to the head, Master Chief. Ray replied, his hand steady on the throttle. I'll get you to the cove. Lies are like salt water. A little bit tastes like the truth, but too much will kill you from the inside out. I was drinking deeply from that. Well now, knowing that every fabrication bought me the time I needed to secure my perimeter. While Ray navigated the darkening coastline, my mind drifted to what was happening at the marina. I could almost see the scene unfolding through the eyes of the witnesses who would later testify. Derek would have crashed the Catherine Rose into the pier at full throttle, a calculated act of violence against the wood to ensure a crowd was watching. He would have leaped onto the dock, collapsing in a fit of theatrical gasping sobs that sounded more like a wounded animal than a grieving son. He would have screamed for a Coast Guard unit he knew was already too late to help. In his mind, he was the victim, the hero of a tragedy he had authored with a shove and a cold line about sharks. He didn't just forget his father, he had actually thrown a weighted life ring into the water in the opposite direction of my fall, ensuring that any rescue effort would start miles away from where I was actually drowning. How much practice does it take to sob for a man you just tried to feed to the sharks? Is there a mirror in hell where he rehearsed those lines? I watched the distant lights of Crescent Bay through, the salt-crusted glass of the wheelhouse feeling a cold, clinical disgust. By now, Derek would be consolidating his alibi. He would be making a very public recorded call to the Coast Guard, providing the exact false coordinates of the accident. Vanessa Sterling, 39, arrived at the docks with her hair perfectly windswept and a handkerchief already dampened by what looked like genuine tears, her eyes sharp and assessing even through her mourning mask. She would have been there to hold him to play the part of the supportive wife while they shared a choreographed moment of despair in front of the local news crew. I knew Vanessa was the architect. She was the one who had likely picked out the black dress she was wearing before the boat had even cleared the breakwater. She was the one who would ensure the narrative of my cognitive decline was whispered into the ears of every reporter who would listen. You're watching a masterpiece of manipulation. If I weren't the target, I might have actually applauded the effort. I watched a local news feed on Ray's small cabin television, the volume low. There was my son leaning against the hull of the Catherine Rose, his expensive shirt stained with what I knew were crocodile tears. He told the reporter that the current was too strong, that he had circled for an hour, screaming my name until his voice failed. The harbor master was there offering Derek a stiff drink and a shoulder to cry on, completely bought into the performance. Vanessa was at his side, her manicured nails digging into Derek's arm in a display of faux dependency. I looked at the screen and saw Derek clutch his pocket. I knew what was in there. He was secretly clutching my stolen wallet, feeling the plastic of the credit cards that he believed were now his to spend. He thought he was home free, the king of a hill built on my bones. Derek looked into the news camera, his eyes red and leaking fake grief. But for a split second, the mask slipped. It was a tiny predatory smirk, a flash of white teeth that lasted less than a heartbeat, but it was there. It was a smirk that only a dead man would be able to recognize. It said that the mortgage was paid, the land was sold, and the old man was finally mercifully gone. The bright invasive flash of the news camera lights illuminated his triumph. I felt the vibration of the Sea Wanderer's engine change as we approached the abandoned pier. The smell of burnt diesel from Derek's erratic docking was a world away now, replaced by the scent of rotting wood and low-tide mud. I stood up, the navy jacket heavy on my shoulders, and prepared to step into the dark. I was officially a ghost, and the haunting was about to begin. Derek thought he had just closed the book on my life, but he didn't realize he had just handed me the pen to write his ending. Stepping onto the rotting wood of the abandoned pier was like stepping back into the land of the living as a man who no longer officially existed, my wet feet leaving temporary footprints that the evening fog would soon erase. The Sea Wanderer's engines were a low fading thrum in the distance as Captain Ray turned back toward the deep, leaving me in the silence of the marshlands. The smell of rotting wood and low-tide mud was pungent, a thick organic stench that felt grounded compared to the endless sterile salt of the open Pacific. I bid a quiet farewell to Ray, refusing his offer of a ride to the nearest hospital. He looked at me with a sailor's understanding, seeing the set of my jaw, and knowing I wasn't a man who took charity easily. I stood there for a moment, adjusting the oversized navy jacket and gray sweatpants he had given me, feeling the grit of salt still on my skin under the heavy fabric. I wasn't just hiding. I was preparing for a tactical re-entry into a world that had already written my obituary. Derek thought he had pickpocketed my life when he took my wallet during the shove, but he had never understood the level of paranoia I'd cultivated in the teams. The waterproof pocket in my chest harness wasn't for my wallet. It was specifically for a backup debit card and an emergency key to the house. I had been preparing for a worst-case scenario with my own son for years, a depressing reality that was now my only saving grace. I walked a mile down the coastal road, the evening air cooling the raw sunburn on my face. I moved with a deliberate slow gait, looking like just another coastal drifter or an aging veteran who had seen better days. I reached a 24-hour convenience store, the harsh buzzing fluorescent lights overhead, making me squint. I kept my head down the brim of Ray's old cap, low over my bloodshot eyes. I slid my backup debit card into the ATM, the machine letting out a mechanical whir that sounded like a lifeline. I withdrew $400 in cash, the daily limit, knowing I needed to move without a digital trail from this moment forward. The ATM whirred. It was the sound of a lifeline. $400. 400 reasons for Derek to start looking over his shoulder. I took the bills, feeling the crisp paper in my fingers, the first real currency of my new existence as a ghost. Inside the store's grimy restroom, I locked the door and finally faced the mirror. Have you ever looked in a mirror and not known the man looking back? The ocean doesn't just take your clothes, it strips away the person you thought you were. My face was a mask of raw red sunburn, my eyes mapped with broken red veins from the salt and the strain. I looked older by a decade, a weathered ruin of the Master Chief I used to be. I meticulously cleaned the salt from my waterproof GPS watch, and the audio recorder, my hand steady as I confirmed the red recording light, was indeed active for the entire duration of the boat trip. The seal had held. The truth was trapped in that little plastic box, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. I changed into a cheap Marlin print t-shirt I'd grabbed from the rack, pulled on a new ball cap, and slid on a pair of dark sunglasses. "You look like hell, Marcus," I whispered to my reflection, "but hell is exactly where we're going." I looked at the man in the glass and saw a predator hiding in the skin of a drifter. I bought a prepaid burner phone with cash at the counter, the clerk barely looking up from his magazine. I was just another face in the night, a transient passing through a town that didn't know I was supposed to be at the bottom of the ocean. I walked across the street to the Driftwood Motel, a place where the neon sign flickered and no one asked for a credit card or a real name. I paid $65 for Room 17, a stale-smelling box at the very back of the property. Room 17, no windows to the front. Perfect. I entered the room and felt the synthetic stale scent of the motel bedsheets hit me like a physical wall. I checked the perimeter, closing the heavy curtains and ensuring the deadbolt clicked into place with a solid metallic thud. Once the door was secure, the adrenaline that had kept me moving since Ray pulled me from the water finally evaporated. It left me shaking with a bone-deep chill that salt water and navy jackets couldn't cure. I collapsed onto the lumpy mattress, my muscles finally surrendering to the trauma. "I'm alive, Catherine." I breathed into the darkness, but the work is just starting. The motel room smelled of cheap bleach and old secrets. It was a tomb for the living, and for tonight, it was exactly where I belonged. I lay there in the dark, the silence of the room ringing in my ears, but my mind was a hive of strategic calculations. I was a dead man with a mission. I reached for the burner phone, the plastic feeling cheap and fragile in my calloused hands. As I powered it on, a local news alert flashed across the screen. I felt a surge of cold, focused rage. Derek had already given a formal statement to the police, claiming I had been showing signs of early onset dementia to explain why I might have wandered off the boat while he wasn't looking. He was building the wall of his defense before my body had even been declared missing. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a character assassin trying to erase my sanity to protect his greed. I stared at the burner phone screen, the blue light illuminating the deep lines of my face. I knew the lying had to stop, and the truth had to be handed to someone with the power to use it. My thumb hovered over the only number in the world I could still trust, the one person who knew exactly how dangerous my son's wife truly was. This was the call that would turn my survival into a war. I took a breath at the stale air of room 17 filling my lungs and pressed the button. The first ring echoed in the small dark room, a signal fire lit in the middle of a forest of lies. A phone call at 4 in the morning usually means someone has died, but when I finally pressed the green button, I was calling to tell the world's most dangerous lawyer that I had decided to stay alive just to spite my son. The blue light of the burner phone was the only thing illuminating the stale-smelling shadows of room 17. I waited, my pulse a slow, heavy thrum in my salt-crusted ears, until the line clicked open. The voice on the other end was thick with a grief I knew was genuine. Rebecca Sterling, 71, was my sister-in-law, and the family's longtime attorney, a woman who had spent 40 years winning wars in a courtroom. She was the one person who knew the true depth of the shadows lurking behind Derek's eyes. Rebecca? "It's Marcus," I said, my voice sounding like gravel crushed under a boot. "Don't scream. Don't ask how. Just listen." There was a sharp intake of breath, the sound of a glass hitting a table, and then a silence so profound I could almost feel her shock through the airwaves. "Marcus," she whispered, a ghost of a word. I briefly outlined the betrayal, the argument, the push, and the final line about the sharks. Rebecca didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She just asked for the serial number on my recorder. That's when I knew Derek was dead. He just hadn't stopped breathing yet. I was stunned when Rebecca revealed she had already frozen the estate's liquid accounts the moment Derek reported me missing. She hadn't waited for proof. She had smelled the rot in his theatrical grief and acted on the suspicion that had been growing since my wife Catherine passed. For Catherine Marcus, she said, her voice transforming into a cold professional blade, "We are going to burn their world to the ground." Rebecca didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She simply asked for the serial number on my recorder, and in that moment I knew Derek was already finished. He just hadn't stopped breathing yet. We set a meeting for 11 at the Lighthouse Diner. I spent the intervening hours watching the dawn light crawl up the stained motel walls, feeling a grim sense of alliance. I arrived at the Lighthouse Diner 20 minutes early, choosing a booth with my back to the wall and a clear view of the entrance. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and maple syrup, a domesticity that felt alien after the freezing indigo of the Pacific. I kept my dark sunglasses on my marlin print t-shirt, making me look like just another coastal drifter. When Rebecca Sterling walked into the Lighthouse Diner with her sharp stride, her dark suit looked like armor against the casual seaside decor. She scanned the room with the sharp eyes of a litigator, her gaze cutting through the tourists until she locked onto me. She froze for a heartbeat, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her briefcase before sliding into the booth. "You look like you've been to hell, Marcus," she said, her eyes tracing the raw, burned lines of my face. "I have," I replied, but I brought back the receipts. I placed the evidence on the table. The salt-stained GPS watch and the chest harness recorder sat between the sugar shaker and the ketchup bottle, a map and a soundtrack of a murder attempt. Have you ever seen the exact moment a high-powered attorney smells blood? It's not a smile. It's a sharpening of the edges, a sudden lethal focus that makes you glad she's on your side. Rebecca took out a pen and began to take notes, the low rhythmic hum of the diner's ceiling fans, the only accompaniment to our low-voiced war counsel. She reviewed the legal landscape, her expression shifting from focused to grimly satisfied. "Marcus, you need to understand what Catherine did 22 years ago," she said. "My wife had always been the visionary, the one who saw the storm clouds before the first drop of rain. Catherine had insisted on a secret legal landmine in our trust, an in terrorem or no contest clause, specifically modified to protect the trustee from any form of physical or emotional harm. Rebecca explained that by attempting to accelerate his inheritance through a violent act, Derek hadn't just broken the law. He had automatically triggered a permanent, irrevocable disinheritance. Legally, the moment he pushed me into the water, he became a pauper. He thinks he's fighting for a $4 million fortune, but the trust already considers him a stranger. The trust wasn't just a document. It was a ghost shield forged in love and tempered by suspicion, reaching out from 2017 to slap the cuffs on my son's wrists. I felt a surge of awe at Catherine's foresight. She had always known Vanessa was a shark, and she had built this cage for her over 2 decades ago. So, he gets nothing, I asked. Not a single acre, not a single cent, Rebecca confirmed. He gets a prison cell and a bill for the search costs, Marcus. That's his inheritance now. We sat in silence, the sound of a distant waitress clinking plates providing a strange soundtrack to the destruction of my son's life. Rebecca noted that the clause was specifically designed to be triggered by harm to the trustee, which meant Catherine had actually anticipated that Derek might try to physically hurt me. The realization was a cold stone in my stomach. My wife had known our son better than I ever dared to. Rebecca leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper as she signaled for the check. The trust is the shield, Marcus, but we need a sword. I'm calling Jake. We need to know what Derek has been putting in your coffee for the last 6 months. My blood ran cold as I realized the ocean wasn't the first time he had tried to kill me. I had survived the Pacific salt and the shark's hunger, but as I sat in that sterile office, I realized the most lethal predator I'd ever faced had been sitting across from me at the breakfast table for the last 6 months. The transition from the Lighthouse Diner to Rebecca's secure law office was a blur of high-stakes caution. I moved like a ghost through the city, my eyes constantly scanning the mirrors, half expecting to see Derek's designer SUV trailing me. Rebecca didn't waste any time. She introduced me to Jake, a man with the unassuming air of a librarian and eyes that processed data like a supercomputer, who sat behind a desk cluttered with forensic reports and digital breadcrumbs. Jake wasn't an attorney. He was a former forensic accountant turned private investigator, the kind of man who found bodies buried in spreadsheets and murder motives in search histories. As I sat down, the weight of the last few months seemed to settle into my joints. I recounted my physical decline, the tremors that made it hard to tie my boots, the persistent dizziness that made me feel like the room was tilting, and that bitter, metallic taste that always seemed to linger after Derek graciously made his morning espresso for me. Jake listened with a grim knowing nod, his fingers tapping a rhythmic pattern on a folder. He didn't look surprised when he revealed a discovery that chilled my blood. Derek hadn't bought the chemicals on some dark web marketplace. Instead, he had used Vanessa's former corporate login to order industrial-grade thallium under the guise of supplies for a firm that had been defunct for years. It was a paper trail left by someone who thought they were too smart to be caught. I thought I was just getting old, Jake, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. I thought my body was finally giving up on me. Jake looked at me with a pity that hurt more than the betrayal. Did the hair loss start before or after the boat trip? Marcus, he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Espresso, 2 sugars, a dash of cream, and enough poison to stop a horse's heart. That was my special morning routine. Every day I had looked my son in the eye and thanked him for the coffee while he watched me swallow my own death. To maintain my status as a ghost, Jake arranged for a mobile phlebotomist who worked off the books, a woman who didn't ask why a man in a motel room needed a deep tox panel. In the dim flickering light of the Driftwood Motel, I watched as the needle slid into my arm. The dark viscous blood filled the glass vials, a thick salt-heavy fluid that felt like it belonged to a dead man already. The sharp metallic smell of the phlebotomy alcohol prep pad filled the small room, a clinical scent that cut through the smell of bleach and old carpet. Jake explained that standard medical panels don't look for heavy metals like thallium, which is why my previous doctor visits had yielded nothing but shrugs and talk of natural aging. I had visited my family doctor twice in the last 6 months, complaining of dizziness and tremors. Both times, the standard blood panels came back normal because they never tested for heavy metals like thallium. Thallium is the poisoner's poison, Jake said, his voice low, colorless, odorless, and patient. It mimics a dozen other diseases while it eats you from the inside out. My own son, Jake, I said, looking at the vials. He watched me drink it every single morning. He watched the tremors get worse, and he just smiled and poured another cup. The wait for the results was an agonizing stretch of hours. Every muscle twitch, every flicker of light in my eyes felt like a new symptom, a reminder of the silver snake coiling in my veins. How do you measure the distance between a father's love and a son's greed? In milligrams, in months, or in the cold blue light of a lab report? We met back at the office after dark. The high-speed printer was churning out the chemical verdict, the rhythmic clacking of the machine sounding like a death knell. Jake stared at the glowing screen of his laptop for a long time before turning it toward me. The levels of thallium sulfate in my system were 10 times the lethal limit for a standard man. It was a testament to my seal-hardened constitution that I was even sitting upright, let alone surviving a 15-mile swim. The data showed a consistent low-dose administration dating back at least 6 months. The boat trip wasn't a sudden impulse, I realized with a sickening clarity. It was a cleanup operation. The slow method was taking too long, and Derek's debts were mounting faster than the poison could work. He had run out of patience. "You're not dying of old age, Marcus," Rebecca said, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the desk. "You're being murdered by degrees." The thallium was a silver snake in my veins, coiling around my heart, while I thanked Derek for being such a thoughtful son. But the lab report had one more horror to share. There was a second chemical found in the sample, a high-grade sedative. Jake explained that the concentration suggested it had been added to my water bottle on the boat that morning. It explained why my reaction time had been so sluggish when Derek lunged, why the man who had survived 100 ambushes had been caught so easily by his own amateur son. He hadn't just poisoned me. He had drugged me to ensure I couldn't fight back when he pushed me into the abyss. He didn't just want me dead. He wanted me to suffer the whole way down a slow chemical execution. I felt a sandpaper dry feeling in my throat as I read the chemical names, the cold clinical glow of the laptop screen, making the world feel small and dark. My rage was no longer a hot, frantic thing. It had tempered into a hard, cold blade. I was a Master Chief, and I had been under attack in my own home for half a year. Jake closed the laptop with a definitive thud, the sound echoing in the silent office. "We have the toxin, Marcus, but I just found something in Derek's search history that's even worse. He wasn't just planning for your death." I looked at him, my heart freezing in my chest. He was planning for Thomas's accidental disappearance, too. The room went silent. Derek wasn't just clearing the way for the inheritance, he was clearing the bloodline. My grandson was next on the list, and I was the only person left alive who could stand in the way. A father's heart can withstand the impact of a freezing ocean, but it shatters like glass when he realizes the son he raised hasn't just plotted his murder, but has already set a price tag on the life of his own child. Jake had closed the laptop with a definitive thud that still echoed in the small, secure law office, the silence that followed heavy with the stench of human rot. We had the toxin, the thallium, that had been silvering its way through my veins, but the digital breadcrumbs Jake had unearthed were far more lethal. The investigation into the hidden search history and encrypted cloud drives belonging to my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, was beginning to yield a map of absolute devastation. I sat in the hardback chair, the dry electronic smell of the overheating laptop, mingling with the cold, metallic taste of the office water cooler cup. I watched Jake's face, usually as impassive as a stone titan, with a grim professional disgust. He didn't just find a murder plot. He found a ledger where my family had been reduced to depreciating assets. The shock was deeper than the Pacific Shelf, a chilling realization that Derek's shove on the boat was only the final stroke in a long-term liquidation project. Jake presented the financial picture with a clinical detachment of an undertaker. Derek's gambling debt wasn't just a figure on a screen. It was a hungry beast. He owed a staggering $185,000, not just to offshore sites, but to local loan sharks who had already begun making unannounced visits to my grandson's college campus. I read the intercepted texts, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the edge of the desk. My son had offered Thomas's future trust fund as collateral for another month of silence from his creditors. He used Thomas's name. I asked, my voice a jagged ruin. He put his own son in the crosshairs of these animals. Jake nodded, his eyes fixed on the scrolling green business code on the screen. To a gambler in a hole, Marcus, everyone is just another chip on the table. The entry twist was even more nauseating. The coded journal revealed that Vanessa had been siphoning Derek's few winnings into a private account in the Cayman Islands. She was robbing her own husband while he was robbing his father, a double cross within a betrayal. Spreadsheets. That's how she killed me. Not with a knife, but with a series of cells and formulas that decided my heartbeat was no longer cost-effective. We moved deeper into the drive, cracking a file titled Project MS that had been created 3 years ago, while my wife Catherine was still fighting for her final breaths. It was a meticulously designed timeline for my health decline protocol. Vanessa had scripted my death with the precision of a software launch. There were spreadsheets for the dosage of thallium notes on the SED8 sedatives I had swallowed in my morning coffee, and milestones for when my disorientation would be believable enough to claim dementia. This wasn't a murder plot, Marcus, Rebecca said, her voice trembling with a cold fury. It's a hostile takeover of a human life. I watched the data scroll, seeing every tremor I had felt and every dizzy spell I had blamed on age listed as a successful test phase. She didn't just know I whispered the rage finally burning through the last of my shock. She designed it. Derek was merely the blunt instrument, the cheap labor she hired to knock down the walls of our legacy. Do you know what it's like to realize you've been a project for 3 years? It makes you wonder if every smile she gave you was just a check mark on a compliance list. Rebecca and I analyzed the notes further, finding a section dedicated to collateral asset TS. It was Thomas, my grandson. Vanessa had already mapped out his destruction. She planned for Thomas to be institutionalized or discredited via a manufactured drug scandal at his university to ensure he couldn't challenge the land sale once I was gone. She's a sociopath, Marcus Rebecca said, her eyes fixed on the screen. She doesn't see a grandson. She sees a legal complication. I felt the weight of my 73 years, but for the first time, the fatigue was gone. It was replaced by the lethal, focused clarity of a master chief on a mission. I spent 30 years hunting monsters in foreign lands, Rebecca. I never expected to find the worst one living in my guest room. Vanessa was the architect, and my son was just the fool she manipulated to clear the foundation. My son had sold his soul, but my grandson was still innocent, and I was the only wall left standing between him and the demolition crew. I stood up, the sound of my heavy rhythmic breathing, the only noise in the room, as I fought to keep the tactical part of my brain in command. The fatigue of the ocean and the poison was being overwritten by a survival instinct that had been forged in the teams and tempered in blood. We were no longer just gathering evidence for a trial. We were in a battle for Thomas's life. I looked at the maps of the estate and the trust documents, realizing the scale of Vanessa's ambition. She wanted the land, the money, and the silence of everyone who could remember the Sterling name with honor. She had spent years eroding my life, milligram by milligram, waiting for the moment to strike. I realized then that I couldn't just survive. I had to dismantle Vanessa Sterling completely, piece by calculated piece, until there was nothing left of her script but ash. Jake's hands suddenly froze on the keyboard. His eyes widened, and he leaned into the screen, his face pale in the blue light. "Marcus," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I found something else." He opened a folder at the bottom of the encrypted drive. I looked up from the screen and saw a grainy black and white photo of myself entering the Driftwood Motel just high hours ago. My heart stopped. It was a high-angle shot taken from across the street, capturing me in the marlin print shirt I had bought after the rescue. The hunter had become the hunted. Vanessa's private investigator hadn't just been looking for my body. He had already found me. She knew I was alive. She knew exactly where I was sleeping. The realization hit me like a physical blow, a surge of vulnerability mixed with a lethal tactical focus. Vanessa was already moving her pieces for the final kill, and my safe house was nothing more than a cage with a target painted on the door. There is no sound more hollow than the official declaration of your own death, a cold electronic broadcast that erases 73 years of life with the clinical finality of a news anchor's sigh. I stood in the center of room 17, the grainy black and white photo of myself entering the motel clutched in my hand like a death warrant. The realization that Vanessa Sterling was the architect of my family's destruction had settled into my bones with a lethal tactical focus. I didn't have time for shock. I knew the Driftwood Motel was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, and Vanessa's hunter was already outside closing the perimeter. I utilized my SEAL training in counter-surveillance, moving with the silent efficiency of a shadow. I ignored the front door, knowing a professional would be watching the parking lot. Instead, I moved to the rear of the room, found the service access for the laundry chute, and slipped through. I disappeared into the pre-dawn fog before Vanessa's people could even coordinate their move. I had purposely allowed that motel photo to be taken earlier, a calculated risk to draw them toward a fixed point, while I moved to a secondary, more secure location I had scouted years ago. The bus hissed to a stop. No one looked at me. I was just another old man in a hoodie. Perfect. The world is built on people not looking. I paid in cash, keeping my hood up and my eyes down, as the local bus rattled 30 miles south towards South Cove. I wasn't a person anymore. I was a ghost moving through a landscape of indifferent commuters. I settled into a different dive motel, a place even more forgotten than the Driftwood, where I could watch the fallout of my disappearance from a safe distance. The room was dim, the air heavy with the smell of diesel fumes from the nearby highway, and the grainy flickering blue light of a small television bolted to the wall. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the static-heavy radio, first then turning to the local news. How do you grieve for yourself? Do you stand for the moment of silence, or do you just laugh at the absurdity of hearing your life summarized in a 30-second news segment? The broadcast was clinical. The Coast Guard commander appeared on screen, his face a mask of official regret, as he announced that the active search for Marcus Sterling had been suspended. The Pacific had been declared the victor, and I was formally listed as presumed lost. The weight of my non-existence settled over me, a bizarre feeling of being a witness to my own funeral without the benefit of a coffin. "You hear that, Kath?" I whispered to the empty, peeling walls. "I'm officially a ghost now." The news segment didn't end with the Coast Guard. The screen cut to a live interview in front of the Catherine Rose, docked and still a silent monument to the betrayal. Derek Sterling stood there, dressed in a black suit that looked a size too expensive for a man who had just lost his father. He wore a mask of calculated sorrow, his voice cracking at just the right moments as he praised me as a hero and a pillar of the community. But I saw the truth behind the crocodile tears. He spoke about the tragedy of cognitive decline, subtly reinforcing the lie of my dementia to the public, to ensure no one would question my supposed accident. I pulled out my burner phone and began recording the broadcast. Every word he spoke was another layer of paint on the masterpiece of fraud he was creating. Derek's voice on the TV was like oil on water, shimmering and pretty on the surface, but toxic to anything trying to breathe beneath it. He was already measuring the drapes in my house while he was still crying on camera, his mind likely tallying the market value of the Pine Grove Catherine and I had loved. As the reporter asked a final question about the estate, Derek reached up to wipe a stray tear. That was when I saw it. The camera zoomed in for a close-up of his grieving face, and my heart skipped a beat before hardening into a cold, vibrating rage. Derek was wearing my own vintage Navy SEAL ring, the gold and onyx trophy I had kept on my dresser for decades. He hadn't even waited for the search to end. He had looted my bedroom the moment he thought I was gone, claiming the physical symbols of my honor for himself. He stood there pretending to be the devastated son while wearing a dead man's ring on his hand. It was the ultimate desecration. I felt a surge of disgust so powerful it made my hands shake, but I forced the emotion down, channeling it back into the mission. Derek thought he had just closed the book on my life, but he didn't realize he had just handed me the pen to write his ending. He was so confident in his performance that he didn't notice the tiny flaws, the small, arrogant slips that a seasoned operator would never miss. I turned off the television, the silence of the room ringing in my salt-damaged ears. The grainy blue light vanished, leaving me in the dark with nothing but the low-frequency hum of the highway. Derek and Vanessa were moving fast, now convinced the path was clear. They had the public sympathy, the official declaration of death, and a fabricated medical history. They were preparing to walk into the county clerk's office and claim the life I had built. I sat in the shadows, my mind mapping out the counter-strike. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was the variable they hadn't accounted for in their spreadsheets. The seal ring on Derek's finger was a countdown, a reminder that every second he spent pretending to be me was a second closer to his own destruction. Tomorrow, they would make their move to file the fraudulent petition, believing they were walking toward a fortune. They didn't know they were walking straight into the trap Rebecca and I had been setting in the dark. Greed is a clumsy assassin. It doesn't just leave a body behind. It leaves a paper trail of ink and lies that acts as a beacon for anyone patient enough to watch the wheels of bureaucracy turn. I woke up on the morning of day 16 in the South Cove Motel, the early light filtering through a thin layer of highway grime on the window. I didn't need an alarm. My body was still tuned to the rhythm of a mission, and today was the day my son would attempt to legally bury me. I sat in the dark, the burner phone humming on the nightstand, waiting for the signal from Rebecca. The air in the room was stale, but my mind was sharp, fueled by a cold anticipation and moral disgust. I had spent 73 years building a name, and I was about to watch Derek use a ballpoint pen to try and erase it all for a few $1 million and a developer's handshake. At 9:10 a.m., the phone vibrated. Rebecca's voice was crisp, cutting through the silence. "They're here, Marcus, dressed in black and looking like professional mourners." Her insider at the county clerk's office, a woman named Jennifer, was providing real-time updates. I listened. My jaw clenched as Rebecca described the scene. Derek and Vanessa had walked through those glass doors carrying a folder that I knew contained a masterpiece of fiction. They had the official Coast Guard report, the one that said I was presumed lost, and a stack of fabricated medical evidence they'd been preparing for months. I sat in that dim motel room, listening to the play-by-play of my own son, effectively digging my grave while I was still breathing. Ink, paper, perjury. It's amazing how easy it is to kill a man with a ballpoint pen if you have enough ice in your veins. Let them sign Rebecca, I whispered. Every stroke of the pen is another year in a cell. The narrative shifted to the clinical, dust-heavy atmosphere of the government office. I could almost hear the rhythmic sound of the rubber stamps hitting the wood. Jennifer reported that Derek had presented a sworn affidavit looking the clerk directly in the eye as he spun his web. He described my supposed cognitive disorientation with the practiced ease of a stage actor. He spoke of early-onset Parkinson's, claiming the fishing trip had been a final, desperate attempt to give me one last good day before the darkness took me. He didn't just forge my name. He had presented a fabricated letter from a non-existent neurologist to prove my condition, creating a secondary trail of mail fraud that he was too arrogant to see. He signed the petition for special administrator under penalty of perjury, a move designed to bypass the normal waiting period and gain immediate control of the trust's liquid assets. Does a liar ever feel the weight of the air change when they sign their name to a masterpiece of fiction? Or is the greed so loud it drowns out the sound of their own soul rotting? By 10:30 a.m., the wire was tripped. Rebecca called back, her voice vibrating with a grim satisfaction. He signed it, Marcus, 9:23 a.m. He just handed us the keys to his prison cell. By lying about my medical condition to a government official under oath, Derek had escalated his crime from a domestic dispute to a felony fraud against the state. His arrogance was his undoing. He believed I was too demented or too dead to ever return and challenge the record. He had created the very evidence we needed to destroy his legal standing in the family trust forever. He didn't just lie about me, Rebecca. I said, the bitter metallic taste of adrenaline sharp in my mouth. He tried to rewrite my entire identity. Derek thought he was unlocking the vault to his future, but he was really just tightening the noose around his own legal neck. He was so focused on the prize that he didn't realize the trap had already snapped shut the moment the ink dried on the page. I looked at the walls of the motel, feeling a strange sense of strategic victory. We had him. The paper trail was complete, and the crime was documented in the public record. But as I prepared to move to the next phase, Rebecca's voice changed. It turned ice cold through the speaker, the professional edge giving way to something more personal. There's more Marcus. He didn't come to the office alone. My heart skipped a beat, a cold dread seeping into my chest. Who was with him, I asked. He brought Thomas, Rebecca, said, her voice heavy with pity. And he made your grandson sign as a witness to your deterioration. The room seemed to grow darker. Derek hadn't just committed a crime. He had forced my grandson to participate in it. He had used Thomas's love and grief to make him a witness to a lie, effectively branding the boy as an accomplice in his own grandfather's murder. The betrayal was no longer just about me. It was about the corruption of the next generation. I gripped the burner phone so hard the plastic groaned. The visual of Thomas's hesitant, shaking hand, holding that pen, burned into my mind. My son was a virus, and he was using my grandson's innocence as a host. I felt a surge of righteous fury that surpassed anything I had felt in the Pacific. Derek had signed his own warrant, but he had also put a target on Thomas's back. The petition revealed that Derek had requested an emergency liquidation of the Sterling estate, proving he intended to sell the property and flee the country within the month. He was moving fast, but I was moving faster. I wasn't just a ghost anymore. I was a protector. I needed to reach Thomas before Vanessa decided the boy was a loose end that needed to be disposed of. The morning of day 16 had started with a paper trail, but it was ending with a declaration of war. A man can train to survive the deepest oceans and the coldest winters. But there is no training manual for the moment you realize your own son has turned your grandson into a weapon for your destruction. I sat in the dim light of Rebecca's office, my hands gripping the edge of the mahogany desk until the wood bit into my palms. Rebecca was detailing the scene at the county clerk's office as reported by her contact, Jennifer. It wasn't just a clinical filing of paperwork. It had been a masterclass in psychological warfare. Derek didn't just ask Thomas to sign those documents. He had performed for the boy. He told 19-year-old Thomas that I was losing my grip on reality and that the only way to fund my upcoming expensive medical care was to liquidate the estate immediately. I could almost hear Derek's voice, the practiced tremor, the fake sincerity. Thomas, visibly distressed and tearful, had been coerced into witnessing a lie under the guise of family duty. I felt a fresh wave of protective fury, realizing my grandson was as much a victim of Derek's greed as I was. He used the boy's love for me to make him a criminal. Rebecca, I whispered, my voice thick with a rage that salt water couldn't extinguish. Derek didn't just steal my life. He's stealing Thomas's soul. Jake produced copies of the 4 land sale documents that Thomas had been forced to witness. I stared at the pages, the smell of old paper and legal ink filling the small room. The signatures for Marcus Sterling were shaky amateurish forgeries that Derek had clearly practiced until he could mimic the tremors of a dying man. Rebecca explained the legal trap by having Thomas sign. As a witness, Derek had legally tied his own son to a felony. If the truth came out in the wrong way, Thomas would be an accomplice. I looked at the boy's signature, usually bold and confident, now a jagged, trembling ruin at the bottom of a lie. Witness. It's a heavy word. It usually means someone who saw the truth, but Derek used it to describe a boy he forced to sign a masterpiece of fiction. I realized that while the in terrorem clause would protect the land, only a face-to-face truth could protect Thomas from being dragged down into the abyss with his parents. How do you tell a child his father is a monster without becoming a monster yourself? Where is the tactical training for that kind of ambush? Jake's fingers danced across his keyboard, uncovering another layer of the rot. Derek hadn't just used Thomas's signature, he had used his identity. Jake discovered that Derek had already used my grandson's clean credit history to open 3 high-interest credit cards to fund his gambling debts while waiting for the estate liquidation. My son was a virus, and he was using my grandson's innocence as a host to spread his greed into the next generation. My heart shattered as I realized the Project MS Journal had a final phase. Once the land was sold, Derek and Vanessa planned to move Thomas to a treatment center in Switzerland. It sounded like a vacation, but I knew the tactical reality they were going to isolate him, cutting him off from any remaining family friends who might tell him the truth. They weren't just stealing his money, they were stealing his reality. I stood up the low, steady hum of the office air conditioner, the only sound in the room. The decision was no longer about legal strategy. It was about a rescue mission. Before I revealed the detail behind that cryptic message I sent, "Are you still with me? Patience, if you think I should stay hidden, or revenge, if I should confront him now. And tell me why in one sentence. Please note that what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes, as the core message is what I hope stays with you. If this crosses your comfort line, you are free to click away now. I decided that the ghost phase of my survival had to partially end. I could not let Thomas remain a pawn in Vanessa's master script. Despite the lethal risk of exposure to Vanessa's private investigator, I began planning a clandestine meeting at a campus coffee shop. This was the most climactic emotional moment of my journey, choosing to risk my tactical advantage to save the one remaining member of the Sterling family who still carried honor. I'm going to see him. I told Rebecca, my jaw set with a lethal resolve. I have to be the one to tell him he's been lied to. It's a risk, Marcus, she warned. Vanessa is watching every shadow. I looked at her, my eyes reflecting the steel of my Navy years. I'm a SEAL, I said. We don't leave our own behind. I reached for the burner phone, the plastic feeling cold and cheap. The sharp, stinging taste of cold coffee lingered on my tongue as I prepared to send the signal. My son was a butcher, but I was still the Master Chief, and I was about to execute the most important extraction of my life. I typed 5 words into the burner phone, words that only Thomas and I knew, from his 7th birthday, a secret code from a time before the poison and the greed. As I hit send, I knew the ghost was officially coming out of the shadows. There would be no turning back from the storm I was about to unleash on Derek and Vanessa. I watched the sent confirmation pulse on the screen, a digital flare launched into a dark sky. I felt the weight of my 73 years, but the fatigue was gone, replaced by a sacrificial love that demanded action. The hunt was no longer just about justice. It was about reclamation. I was going to get my grandson back, even if I had to burn the Sterling name to the ground to do it. The game had changed, and Vanessa was about to find out that a cornered predator is the most dangerous thing in the woods. I stood in the darkness of the pine grove Catherine had planted 40 years ago, watching the warm, golden light of my own home spill across the grass, while a group of strangers toasted to the successful theft of my life. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and salt spray, a combination that usually brought me peace, but now only fueled a cold tactical fire in my gut. I moved through the shadows of the property, like the ghosts they believed me to be, methodically observing the desecration of my sanctuary. Heavy machinery, yellow and predatory, sat parked near the grove, ready to tear into the earth the moment the ink on the fraudulent land sale dried. Through the open windows, I heard the high-pitched manic laughter of guests. Catherine's hand-painted watercolor, the one she finished the summer before she got sick, was gone from the mantel. In its place sat a soulless metal sculpture, a jagged piece of modern vanity that signaled the systematic erasure of our marriage. They hadn't just moved in, they were skinning my history alive. "One more hour, Kath," I whispered. "Then I take it all back." My house looked like a beautiful corpse dressed up in expensive jewelry and bright lights to hide the fact that its heart had been ripped out. I adjusted the collar of my jacket, feeling the stinging coldness of the evening breeze on my salt-scoured skin. My son was inside playing the role of the visionary heir, likely unaware that the very gates he thought kept the world out had been opened for me by his own son. The cryptic message I'd sent to Thomas hadn't just been a lifeline for the boy. It was a tactical necessity. Thomas, recognizing the code from his 7th birthday, had unlocked the security gate to let his grandfather come home. Derek was busy hosting Philip the architect and a woman named Linda from Meridian Development. I watched them from the terrace. They had spread blueprints across the antique coffee table, an heirloom from Catherine's grandmother, now being treated like a common workbench. They drank expensive champagne as they discussed the infinity pool that would replace the sea grape trees I had tended for decades. How do you toast to a man's death in the very room where he used to hold you? Does the champagne stay sweet? Or does it start to taste like the salt water he choked on? The callousness of their conversation was a physical weight. "Sentiment doesn't pay for a resort, Derek," I heard the architect say. "Once these trees are cleared, the view is a $5 million asset." Derek smirked a look of pure arrogance that made me realize I had never truly known the man I raised. To the future Derek toasted in leaving the past where it belongs 10 miles out at sea. I felt my jaw set, my training overriding the urge to simply smash through the glass. This required precision. I moved away from the terrace toward the front porch, the rhythmic sound of crickets providing a cadence for my final approach. I was no longer the drowning man. I was the hunter closing the distance on a target that thought the war was already won. Vanessa Sterling reached the door first. She had been boasting about the demolition schedule, her voice carrying that sharp edge of a woman who calculates every breath for profit. The doorbell rang, a piercing intrusion into their celebratory bubble. I saw her through the glass as she placed her champagne tumbler on the mahogany side table with a sharp clink. She smoothed her black designer dress and walked toward the door. She was expecting a late delivery, or perhaps a neighbor. She certainly wasn't expecting the sea to give up its dead. I stepped out of the shadows and onto the porch positioned directly under the light so there would be no mistake. The latch clicked open. The heavy oak door swung inward, revealing the foyer and the woman standing within it. Clink. Clack. The tumbler hit the wood. The lock turned. The world as they knew it ended with a simple piece of brass moving in a cylinder. Vanessa stood there, her greeting dying in her throat as she stared into my gaunt, sunburned face. I saw the precise second the reality shattered. The color drained from her face so fast, it looked like a mask of white ash, her jaw dropping as she stared into the eyes of a man she had spent years trying to bury. "Hello, Vanessa," I said, my voice steady. "I believe you're in my house." I didn't reach for a weapon. I didn't need to. In my hand, I held the original photo of Catherine and Thomas, the one Derek thought was lost to the Pacific. It was the ultimate physical proof. I watched the light of the entryway hit her eyes, seeing the terror take root, as she realized the ghost wasn't just haunting her dreams, he was standing on her doorstep. I stepped across the threshold without waiting for an invitation, the weight of my boots on the hardwood, sounding like a drumbeat of reclamation. The party in the living room continued for a few more seconds, the sound of Derek's laughter drifting into the foyer, but the silence radiating from Vanessa was contagious. She was frozen, a statue of terrified guilt, her manicured nails digging into the doorframe as if she could hold the lie together by force. The guests began to turn their faces, shifting from curiosity to confusion as they saw the weathered man standing in the hall. The air in the house seemed to grow thin. Derek's back was to me, but I could see his reflection in the mirror. I watched him freeze his glass, halting halfway to his lips, as he recognized the face of the father he thought he had fed to the sharks. The silence of the entryway was absolute, a frozen moment, before the storm I had brought back from the deep finally broke over their heads. I didn't wait for an invitation to enter the house I'd built with my own hands. I walked past Vanessa's frozen form, my boots echoing on the hardwood like the drumbeat of a returning army. The air in the foyer was a cloying mixture of expensive floral perfume and the salty iron scent of the ocean I had brought in with me on my skin. I didn't look back at the woman who had spent 3 years treating me like a ledger item to be balanced and then deleted. My focus was on the living room, where the golden light of the chandelier illuminated a scene of high society greed that was about to be dismantled. I moved with a lethal silent authority that the guests clearly mistook for a ghost's glide until the weight of my footfalls registered. I hadn't just walked in through the front door. I had been standing on the terrace for the last 20 minutes, my hidden wire capturing every syllable of the developer's conversation regarding the accidental nature of my passing and the convenient timing for their resort project. I had the blueprints of my own home's destruction in my sights, and I was the variable they hadn't accounted for in their spreadsheets. I stepped into the living room, coming face to face with Derek. He was mid-laugh leaning over a Meridian executive named Linda, probably sharing some clever anecdote about his sudden inheritance. The moment his eyes met mine, the laughter didn't just stop. It died a violent death. Derek dropped his champagne glass. It shattered against the floor, the sharp crack echoing through the sudden vacuum of the room. The smell of spilled champagne rose as his face drained of color, turning a sickly white, the look of a man watching his own execution. Dad, no, it's a miracle you're alive. He stammered, his voice thin and trembling with terror he couldn't hide. I stood there unmoving, the weight of the ocean still clinging to me like a shadow. I looked at him, my voice steady and cold. I was waiting for you, Derek, and I have something for you too. I gestured to the door as Rebecca Sterling entered with the detectives. There are no miracles here today, Derek, I said, my voice steady and low, only the truth coming home to roost. Glass shattered, blueprints tore. In 60 seconds, Derek went from a multimillionaire to a man who couldn't afford the air he was breathing. The doorbell rang again, a sharp, repetitive chime that broke the paralysis of the room. Rebecca Sterling entered, flanked by 2 detectives from the sheriff's department. Their heavy footfalls on the wood were a deliberate rhythmic contrast to the light, airy music that had been playing moments ago. Rebecca didn't offer greetings. She walked directly to the antique coffee table, the one Catherine's grandmother had passed down, and slammed her leather briefcase on top of the Meridian blueprints. The sound was like a gavel. She began a clinical rapid-fire recitation of the crimes committed in this very room and at the county clerk's office. Derek Sterling, you signed an affidavit under penalty of perjury, stating your father was disoriented and suffering from early-onset Parkinson's, she said, her eyes cutting through him like a serrated blade. He looks quite focused to me. Linda and the other executives began to back away toward the terrace, their faces masks of corporate self-preservation, as they realized they were standing in a crime scene. This is a private matter, Vanessa shrieked from the doorway, trying to regain her footing. Get out of my house! Rebecca didn't even turn around. She just began pulling the cold, dry legal documents from her bag. Have you ever heard your own betrayal played back to you in high definition? It doesn't sound like a movie. It sounds like the closing of a prison gate. The lead detective produced a clear evidence bag containing my waterproof audio recorder. The red recording light was dead now, but the data inside was immortal. He placed it on the table and pressed play. The high-pitched electronic hiss of the playback gave way to the high-fidelity sound of the Pacific wind, the slapping of waves against the Catherine Rose, and the heated argument about the property. The room went so silent I could hear Derek's frantic, shallow breathing. Then the voice came through Derek's voice, clear and sharp, telling me to say hello to the sharks. The roar of the boat engine followed a mechanical scream that filled the living room and stripped away every lie he had ever told. Derek collapsed into my old armchair, the only piece of furniture he hadn't managed to replace yet. He looked small, a broken child caught in the wreckage of his own greed. I didn't mean... It was a joke. I was going to turn around. He sobbed, but the recording didn't lie. It didn't have a son's bias or a father's hope. The audio recording wasn't just evidence. It was a digital ghost screaming the truth into the faces of people who had built a temple out of lies. I watched Derek, feeling a hollow sense of justice. Listen to yourself, Derek, I said, the words as cold as the deep shelf water. That's the sound of a son's love, isn't it? Rebecca adjusted her glasses and looked at the detectives. She then turned her gaze back to the ruined man in the chair. According to the in terrorem clause, your mother insisted upon your attempt on Marcus's life has triggered an immediate and total forfeiture of your status in the trust, she announced. But it goes further. You are now legally required to pay back every cent of the funds you have liquidated over the last 30 days. You aren't an heir, Derek. You are a debtor to the estate you tried to kill. He was a pauper in a designer suit, surrounded by people who were already looking at him like a stain on the floor. Derek looked at Vanessa, his eyes pleading for a way out for a lie they hadn't used yet. But his wife didn't look back. She was standing by the window, already reaching for her own phone with trembling manicured fingers. Her face was a cold mask of pure self-preservation, the eyes that once looked at me with faux pity now darting around the room, calculating her own exit strategy. I knew that look. It was the look of a mastermind about to pull the final trigger on her own husband to keep herself from being dragged into the dark. She wasn't going to save him. She was going to bury him deeper to find a way to breathe. The detectives moved in the metallic clink of handcuffs, sounding like a final punctuation mark to the celebration. I turned toward the window, looking out at the pine grove, knowing that the real fight, the one against the architect of this nightmare, was only just beginning. Loyalty among thieves is a fairy tale, but loyalty between sociopaths is a suicide pact. And I watched with grim satisfaction as Vanessa Sterling prepared to sharpen the knife she'd been hiding for her own husband. The living room was heavy with the smell of spilled champagne and the cold reality of my presence. Derek, backed into a corner by the audio evidence of his own murderous intent, launched a desperate final defense. He shouted that I was suffering from severe cognitive decline, and that he had documented proof from my psychiatrist, a Dr. Pierce. He fumbled with his phone, speed dialing a man on speakerphone. "Wait, you don't understand? He's delusional." He screamed, his eyes darting toward the detectives. "Tell them, doctor, tell them about my father's episodes." A voice came through the tinny electronic distortion of the speakerphone, smooth and clinical. "Yes, I've been treating Mr. Sterling for months," the voice said. "His grasp on reality is fragile at best." Derek looked at the detectives with a smug, triumphant grin, claiming the boat recording was just a role-playing exercise to test my disorientation. Lies are like a house of cards. They look impressive until a single honest breeze hits them. Derek was about to feel a hurricane. I remained eerily calm, watching the digital signal pulse on the screen. I knew the man on the phone was a fraud because the actor was using a script I had actually intercepted through Rebecca's private investigator 3 days prior. I stepped closer to the phone. "Doctor," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade, "what was the name of the operation I served on in 1984? "The one we discussed during our last session?" There was a long, static-filled pause. The voice on the phone faltered eventually, giving a generic medical answer about confidentiality and memory loss. That was when Rebecca signaled the door. "Doctor," Pierce, a man with silver hair and an air of clinical authority that couldn't be bought, stepped into the room with his medical bag in hand. "I have never met this man in my life, the real doctor," Pierce said, gesturing toward Derek, "and I certainly never authorized these phone consultations." The detectives' faces hardened as they realized Derek had been paying a cheap actor to impersonate a medical professional. How much does it cost to buy a fake conscience? Derek found an actor for his phone calls, but he couldn't find anyone to play the part of a son who actually cared. Realizing the doctor scheme had failed, Vanessa Sterling finally dropped her mask of the supportive wife. She didn't look at Derek. She turned to the detectives and pulled a digital file up on her phone, a collection of secret recordings she had made of Derek discussing the disposal of his father. "He's a monster," she cried, her voice a masterpiece of manufactured terror. "I was terrified. He told me if I didn't help with the paperwork, I'd be next." I watched as she heartlessly threw my son under the bus to secure a plea deal for herself, effectively ending their marriage in the middle of a crime scene. Vanessa didn't just step over her husband's body. She used it as a bridge to try and reach the shore of her own safety. "Vanessa." "What are you doing?" Derek stammered, his world collapsing. "We had a deal, but there are no deals with a predator like Vanessa. She saw a sinking ship, and she was the first one into the lifeboat, even if she had to kick her own husband into the water to make room." The lead detective stepped forward, his heavy footfalls on the hardwood, the only sound in the sudden silence. He informed Vanessa that her cooperation would be noted, but the coded journal Jake found in her drive proved she was the architect of Project MS, not a victim. "You're both under arrest for attempted first-degree murder conspiracy and multiple counts of felony fraud," he barked. The room, once filled with the sounds of a celebration, was now silent, except for the metallic, heavy click of handcuffs locking into place. The Meridian executives and the architect fled the house like rats, leaving the antagonists to be marched toward the door. "I didn't do anything," Derek wailed, his voice high and pathetic. "It was her. She wrote the project. You might think this is the end of the story. The bad guys go to jail, the hero stays home. But justice is a slow-cooked meal, and we were only just getting to the main course." I followed them out onto the porch, the bitter, freezing Oregon fog rolling in from the bay. Derek stopped at the top of the stairs, looking at me with genuine pathetic tears. "Dad, please. I'm your only son. You can't let them do this." I looked at him, the man who had stood on the railing of the Catherine Rose and told me to say hello to the Sharks, and I saw nothing but a stranger. "You were my son, Derek." I said the words as cold as the Pacific. But that boy ended a long time ago. The man I see now, I don't know him at all. As the detective shoved him toward the cruiser, I noticed the gold and onyx shimmer on his hand. I reached out my fingers firm and twisted my vintage Navy SEAL ring off Derek's finger. I reclaimed my identity physically as the cruiser door slammed shut. The metal of my ring was cold against my skin, a heavy reminder that honor is something you carry, and greed is something that eventually carries you away. I stood on the porch as the red and blue lights faded into the darkness, the sirens becoming a distant, lonely wail. The fog swallowed the taillights, leaving me alone with the silence of the pine grove. My home was mine again, but the victory felt heavy, a hollow triumph won at the cost of my bloodline. I looked down at the ring on my finger, the anchor and eagle catching the porch light. I was 73 years old, a survivor of the deep and the dark, but the hardest part of the mission was still inside the house. The cruisers vanished into the darkness, but as I turned back to the house, I saw a single light still burning in the upstairs window, the room where Thomas was supposed to be. I took a breath, the salt air finally tasting clean, and stepped back across the threshold to find what was left of my family. The house was finally mine again. But as I stood in the heavy silence of the foyer, I realized that reclaiming a legacy is a hollow victory if you have to break a boy's heart to secure the foundation. The sirens had long since faded into the Oregon fog, leaving only the ghost of Derek's frantic pleading echoing against the walls. I climbed the stairs, my boots heavy on the hardwood. I found Thomas Sterling, a 19-year-old with my own quiet intensity, and eyes that had seen far too much for his age hunched in his childhood bedroom. He was surrounded by the cardboard boxes Derek had already packed for him, the smell of dust and cardboard filling the small space. Thomas didn't look up when I entered. He was staring at his hands, the same hands Derek had forced to sign away my life. I sat on the edge of the bed and began the gut-wrenching process of deconstructing his reality. I showed him the photocopies of the forged documents and explained the Parkinson's lie his father had weaponized against him. Thomas revealed a detail that twisted the knife in my gut. He had actually found a vial of thallium in Derek's desk a week before the boat trip. But he hadn't reported it because Derek told him it was just rat poison for the estate's crawl space. "He told me you were dying," Grandpa Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "He said the money was for your care." I reached out and pulled him into a silent embrace. "He wasn't saving me, Thomas," I said. "He was burying me. And he was using your hand to dig the hole. How do you mend a bond that was forged in a lie? Can a grandfather ever look at his grandson without seeing the ghost of the son who betrayed them both?" I made a solemn promise to the boy that night. The truth would set us both free, but only if he found the courage to speak it in a place where lies were prosecuted. The following 4 months were a siege of a different kind. While Rebecca and Jake worked tirelessly to solidify the chain of evidence, I began the grueling medical process of purging the remaining thallium from my system. The metallic taste of the treatment medicine was a constant bitter reminder of the snake that had been in my veins. The Crescent Bay community was in an uproar as the hero-son narrative dissolved into a sordid tale of attempted parricide, but I remained a recluse within my own walls. I focused entirely on Thomas's recovery and our legal preparation, watching from the shadows as Derek and Vanessa's high-priced defense team tried and failed to dismantle the digital precision of my GPS and audio recorder. Thallium fades. Poison leaves the blood. But the stain of a son's betrayal, that's permanent ink on a father's soul. By the time November 2024 arrived, the internal poison was gone, replaced by a cold clinical resolve. I stood before the county courthouse on the opening day of the trial, dressed in my finest navy dress blues. The fabric was crisp, the medals on my chest a silent declaration of my status and my sanity. The air outside was bitingly cold, but I didn't feel it. I was a Master Chief again, preparing for the final engagement of a long, dirty war. The media presence was a swarm of cameras and flashing lights, but I walked through them without a word, my eyes fixed on the courthouse doors. Walking into that courthouse was like performing a halo jump into enemy territory. The only difference was the weapons were words, and the target was my own blood. Inside, the clinical air of the courtroom felt like a tomb. Rebecca stood before the jury, her opening statement a blistering assault on Derek and Vanessa's character. "This is not a case of a tragic accident, members of the jury," she announced, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "This is a case of a son who measured his father's life in acreage and a wife who scripted his demise in a spreadsheet." I sat in the front row, my back straight, my eyes locked on the back of Derek's head. He looked smaller in his suit, his shoulders slumped as the prosecution began to unveil the Project MS timeline. Every document Jake had recovered was displayed on the large screens, a digital autopsy of a family's murder. "I'm here, Derek," I thought, projecting the words with a silent, lethal intensity. "Look at me." But he wouldn't turn around. He couldn't. He was a coward who had relied on the darkness of the ocean to do his work, and now the bright, unforgiving light of the law was stripping him bare. Then his lead attorney stood up and attempted a shock tactic that reeked of desperation. He argued that my military record was classified, and that I could not be properly cross-examined without violating national security, a pathetic move to keep me off the stand. Rebecca didn't even flinch. She simply produced a waiver from the Department of the Navy, clearing the path for my testimony. The lawyer's face fell, the last of their defenses crumbling in the face of our preparation. The judge pounded the gavel, the rhythmic echoing sound calling for the first witness. The room went silent as the clerk called Thomas Sterling to the stand. I felt my heart hammer against my ribs as my grandson stood up. He looked pale, his hands trembling slightly, but he kept his head high. As he began the long walk toward the witness box, Derek finally turned around. The mask of the grieving son was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated venom. The hatred he directed at his own son was so visceral, it made my blood run colder than the Pacific. It was a predator's snarl, a final attempt to intimidate the boy into silence. Thomas paused for a heartbeat, his eyes meeting his father's, and for a second, I feared he would break. But then he looked at me, seeing the dress blues and the Navy SEAL ring on my finger, and he found his footing. He stepped up to the stand and placed his hand on the Bible, ready to burn his father's world to the ground, to save what was left of our name. The wood of the witness stand is supposed to be a place of truth, but for a 19-year-old boy looking into the eyes of the man who gave him life and then tried to steal his soul, it felt more like an altar for a human sacrifice. Thomas Sterling sat there, his shoulders hunched, the dry copper taste of tension clearly heavy on his tongue as he avoided looking toward the defense table. He began to recount the systematic manipulation he'd endured at the county clerk's office. His voice was a thin, fragile thread as he described how Derek used the fake Parkinson's diagnosis to coerce him into signing the land sale documents. Derek told me that Grandpa's Parkinson's tremors made him too embarrassed to sign documents in public. Thomas whispered a single tear tracking through the dust of the courtroom. So, I signed for him. I thought I was protecting his dignity. He said we were saving the family. The jury watched with rapt attention as Rebecca played a hidden recording from Thomas's own phone, the boy pleading with his father, saying he didn't want to lie, only for Derek's voice to snap back, demanding he do his duty. Tears in a courtroom aren't just water, they're acid. And Thomas's tears were eating right through Derek's expensive silk tie. I watched my son's stoic facade begin to crumble, the first cracks appearing in the foundation of his arrogance. The trial shifted from emotional wreckage to clinical horror as a forensic toxicologist took the stand. Rebecca dimmed the lights, and the green chemical charts on the projector illuminated the room with a sickly artificial glow. They presented the thallium chain, a direct line of evidence linking the monthly purchase records to Vanessa's former corporate account. I sat in the front row, the smell of floor wax and old wood suddenly cloying. Jake provided the digital breadcrumbs recovered from Derek's laptop search queries for undetectable toxins and elderly drowning scenarios. The forensic data showed that the dosage was calculated to mimic the natural progression of a neurodegenerative disorder. It wasn't bad luck, it was chemistry. Vanessa's defense lawyer attempted a desperate pivot, trying to introduce fabricated evidence that I had been abusive to Catherine. But I was ready. I produced a series of letters Catherine had written to Rebecca before her death, praising my devotion and expressing her growing fear of Vanessa's influence. The courtroom felt cold, a clinical air settling over the spectators as they realized this wasn't just a crime of greed, but a long-term assassination attempt. How do you defend a man against his own voice? You don't. You just watch as the words he thought would buy him a life of luxury become the bars of his cage. When it was my turn, I walked to the stand with the measured, rhythmic gait of a man who had spent his life in service. My navy dress blues weren't just a uniform that day. They were armor. Each medal was a shield against the lies my son was trying to bury me under. I felt the tactile sensation of my stiff-starched uniform collar against my neck, a reminder of the discipline that had kept me alive in the Pacific. I recounted the argument at the 15-mile mark with a precision that made the defense's dementia claims look like the fairy tales they were. The judge watched me with a focused intensity as I reached into my pocket and produced the waterproof audio recorder. "I am a Navy SEAL Master Chief," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I do not forget the sound of a man trying to kill me." I pressed play, and the entire courtroom froze. The tinny, haunting sound of the wind and waves filled the room, followed by the jagged edges of our final argument. Then the line that had played in my nightmares for months rang out with high-fidelity clarity: "Say hello to the sharks, Dad." Vanessa covered her face with her hands, but the recording wasn't finished with her. As the volume peaked just before the sound of the splash, a secondary sound emerged, a chilling low-register whisper from the background. "Do it now!" Vanessa's voice hissed seconds before the shove. The revelation that she hadn't just scripted the murder, but was an active whispering participant on that boat, sent a physical shockwave through the room. Derek finally put his head in his hands, his body shaking with a silent, pathetic rhythm of defeat. He was no longer the visionary developer. He was a caught animal, convicted by the very air he had breathed on that deck. The playback reached the sound of the Catherine Rose's engines roaring to life, a mechanical scream that seemed to mock the silence of the courtroom. I looked at the jury and saw the rising outrage in their eyes, a collective judgment that required no deliberation. I had survived the deep blue desert, the silver snake in my veins, and the betrayal of my own blood. As I sat there, I felt a profound sense of vindication, a weight lifting from my chest that had nothing to do with the Oregon fog. The truth was no longer a secret kept by a ghost. It was a public record, a testament to the fact that honor is a substance that cannot be drowned or poisoned. The audio playback clicked off, leaving a silence so profound you could hear Vanessa's heavy, panicked breathing. She looked like she wanted to bolt for the door, her eyes darting toward the exit, while her lawyer sat in stunned silence. The lead detective stood up, then holding a second evidence bag I hadn't seen before. He walked toward the center of the floor and looked directly at my daughter-in-law. "We found the phone you used to record the practice run, Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a prison door slamming shut. Vanessa's mask didn't just slip, it shattered, leaving a hollow, terrified stranger in its place. I looked at the judge, then at my grandson, knowing that while the trial was almost over, the rebuilding of our broken name was a mission that would take the rest of my life. Justice isn't a lightning bolt that strikes from the heavens. It's a slow-moving tide that grinds the sharpest lies into harmless sand. And as the jury foreman stood up, I finally felt the weight of the Pacific leave my bones. The courtroom was a vacuum of held breath, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. I stood tall in my navy dress, blues my back a straight line of starched wool, and 40 years of discipline. Behind the defense table, Derek looked like a man who had already started to rot from the inside out, while Vanessa remained a statue of ice, her gaze fixed on a spot on the far wall. The jury had returned in less than 2 hours of speed. That usually meant one thing in the legal world: the total consensus. The foreman, a man with the tired eyes of a long-haul trucker, cleared his throat and began to read. Guilty on all counts: attempted first-degree murder, felony fraud, conspiracy, poisoning. The words fell like heavy stones into a deep pool. Derek collapsed into his seat, burying his face in his hands, weeping not for the father he tried to kill, but for the 30-year future he had just set on fire. Vanessa attempted a final desperate power reversal, whispering to her lawyer about filing for divorce to separate her assets, but the judge cut the air out of her lungs before she could finish. He froze all her holdings immediately as part of a criminal restitution order. "It's over, Derek," I said, my voice carrying the weight of a final judgment. "The sharks didn't want me, and the world doesn't want you. Guilty. Guilty. Guilty." It sounded like the rhythmic beating of a drum or the steady, honest pulse of a heart that refused to stop. At the sentencing hearing a week later, the clinical air of the room was replaced by a palpable sense of righteous fury. The judge didn't just read the numbers. He delivered a blistering rebuke that stripped away the last of Derek's distraught son mask. He cited the slow poisoning as an act of monstrous psychological torture, a premeditated liquidation of a human soul. Derek was sentenced to 32 years in a state penitentiary. Vanessa, identified as the primary architect of Project MS, received 35. The The cold metallic click of the bailiff's handcuffs locking into place was the most honest sound I had heard in 3 years. As the bailiffs moved in, Derek let out a high, thin wail that echoed off the old wood and floor wax of the courtroom. "Dad, please don't let them take me," he screamed, reaching out with hands that were now shaking with genuine terror. I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt no anger, only a profound, hollow pity. Is 30 years enough to pay for a father's life? Is there a number of days in a cell that can wash the taste of thallium out of a family's history? I watched them being led away, the heavy courtroom doors swinging shut behind them with a finality that felt like the end of a long, dirty war. The gallery filled with community members and the brothers I had served with in the teams remained in a deathly respectful silence. A month later, the crisp December air bit at my face as I walked into Rebecca's law office. The legal war was moving into its final phase of cleanup. Rebecca looked up from a stack of folders, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and hard-won peace. She had the final execution documents for the in terrorem clause of the Sterling Family Trust ready for my signature. As I took the pen, I felt a strange vibration in my hand, not the tremor of poison, but the hum of a legacy being fortified. With a few strokes of ink, Derek and Vanessa were legally treated as if they had predeceased me. They were erased from the family history, their claims to the $5 million inheritance cut away with surgical precision. The trust wasn't just a document, it was a ghost sword that finally cut the ties between my legacy and my son's greed. I looked at Catherine's faded signature from 2002 on the original trust papers, realizing her protective love had been the true weapon that won this war. Rebecca revealed one last secret: my wife had kept a secondary trust account Derek had never discovered. A fund specifically set aside for Thomas's education that was triggered only by an unnatural event involving the main trust. "Catherine saved us, Rebecca," I whispered. "She saw the storm coming 20 years ago." The smell of floor wax and old leather in the office felt like a tether to a life I was finally allowed to reclaim. My grandson was safe, my home was secure, and the traitors were behind bars where their math no longer mattered. I stood up, the navy jacket heavy on my shoulders, and felt the first true breath of relief since the moment I hit the Pacific water. The legal war was over, but as I walked out of the office into the crisp December air, I realized the house in Crescent Bay was still haunted by the things they had taken, and it was time to bring Catherine back home. The stinging chill of the wind was a reminder that I was still alive, still standing, and still the master of my own fate. I looked toward the horizon, the winter sun, a pale, distant promise over the water. It was time to clear the grove, replant the pines, and remind the world that a Sterling's honor is a substance that cannot be drowned, poisoned, or sold. The cruisers and the lawyers were gone, leaving only the quiet work of a man coming home to his own life. A house is just wood and stone until you fill it with the memories of the people you loved, and as I stepped back across my threshold in the winter light, I knew my final mission wasn't to punish the living, but to properly honor the dead. The Sterling estate was cold and silent in January 2025, the air inside smelling of stale perfume and the clinical vacancy of a place that had lost its soul. I spent the first month of the new year methodically undoing the modernization Derek and Vanessa had forced upon these walls. I hauled the soulless metal sculptures, the jagged glass coffee tables, and the depressing gray cushions to the curb. I went down into the basement and retrieved the crates they had hidden away. As I unwrapped Catherine's original hand-painted watercolors and hung them back on the walls, I felt the house begin to breathe again. I restored the antique furniture, each piece a touchstone, to a 40-year history that no amount of greed could ever truly erase. During those quiet weeks, I felt my own physical strength returning. The last traces of the thallium were finally leaving my system, my hand steady as I polished the mahogany. "There you are, Kath," I whispered as I placed her favorite photo back on the mantel. "Welcome back. The house is clean now." I recently received a letter from the state penitentiary. It was from Derek, 4 pages of frantic script, begging for money to hire a new appeals lawyer, claiming he was the real victim of Vanessa's ambition. I didn't write back. I didn't need to use words to tell him where he stood. Instead, I folded a copy of the new foundation's mission statement into an envelope and sent it to his cell. I wanted him to see exactly where his inheritance had gone, to the very veterans and families he had mocked. Furniture can be replaced, paint can be covered, but the peace of a quiet room that has to be earned in the trenches. I earned mine 15 miles out at sea, and Derek was currently earning his in a 6x9 cage. The transition from survival to restoration was complete. I was no longer a ghost. I was a man standing on solid ground, tending to a legacy that had been forged in honor and tempered by a saltwater baptism. In April, as the first buds of spring began to color the pine grove, Rebecca and I hosted a small, solemn gathering to launch the Catherine Sterling Memorial Foundation. I stood in the center of the grove, the smell of fresh pine needles and salt air acting as a tonic for my spirit. I announced to the assembled guests, many of them fellow veterans like Captain Ray, that the entire $5 million value of the estate had been placed into an irrevocable endowment. The land would never be a resort. It was now a protected sanctuary, a place to support the families of Marine veterans and marine conservation in the Humboldt Bay. What is a legacy? Is it a pile of money in a bank, or is it the way the wind sounds through trees that you refuse to let them cut down? I watched with a lump in my throat as Thomas received the first scholarship from the foundation. "I'm proud of you, Thomas," I said, gripping his shoulder. "You're the man your father forgot to be." He looked at me with clear eyes, and I knew the Sterling name finally had a future worth carrying. The story of my survival reached its true conclusion in May 2025. I sat in my old wooden rocking chair on the porch, the rhythmic creaking sound, a comforting percussion against the evening silence. The Catherine Rose was docked safely at the pier below her white hull gleaming in the fading light. The sun painted the sky in strokes of orange and gold, reflecting off the water where I had once fought for every breath. The ocean wasn't my enemy that day in August. It was a mirror reflecting back the man I had forgotten. I was the man who doesn't know how to quit. I took a sip of honest, clean black coffee, the heat of the mug warming my palms. The tactile warmth of the sun on my healed skin was a blessing I no longer took for granted. I reflected on the betrayal, the slow poison, and the long walk back from the dead, realizing that while justice isn't always swift, it is absolute. Rebecca had revealed one final victory before she left for the city. The in terrorem clause hadn't just stripped Derek of his future, it had automatically triggered a clause that transferred his personal savings money he had already siphoned from the trust during a month of grief directly into the Veterans Scholarship Fund. He had unwittingly funded the very education of the son he tried to corrupt. It was a perfect poetic symmetry. I felt a phantom hand on my shoulder, the familiar gentle presence of Catherine, and I knew that my mission was truly complete. I am 73 years old, I am a survivor, and I am finally truly home. The property was fortified, the family honor was restored, and the boy I loved was on a path of his own making. I watched the last sliver of the sun disappear, leaving the world in a peaceful indigo twilight. I closed my eyes, listening to the rhythmic slap of the waves against the pilings, knowing that while the sharks still swim in the deep, they no longer have a place at my table. My son and his wife were gone, their names erased from the ledgers of this house, replaced by the laughter of the veterans' children who would soon walk these trails. I breathed in the scent of the pines, feeling the deep, settled peace of a man who has outlasted his enemies and protected his own. "I'm home, Kath," I whispered into the evening breeze, "and no one can take that away." The mission was over. The watch was finished. I sat in the gathering dark, a Master Chief at rest, listening to the trees tell the story of a man who refused to drown. And to you listening to my story, remember this: the people who share your blood aren't always the ones who will protect your legacy. Looking back on this family revenge story, I realized my mistake was trusting a title like son over the evidence of a man's character. I ignored the signs of greed because I wanted to believe in family. Don't make my mistake. Watch the fruit people bear, not just the name they carry. This family revenge story taught me that true strength isn't just about surviving the ocean. It's about having the integrity to stand for what is right, even when it costs you everything. I believe God put me through that cold Pacific water to show me that honor is a substance that cannot be drowned. When greed tries to swallow your life, let your faith be the anchor that holds you steady against the tide. Grandpa's stories like mine aren't just about justice, they're about the legacy you leave behind. As one of those grandpa stories you might pass down, I hope this reminds you, protect what matters. Trust actions over words, and never let betrayal steal your peace. These grandpa stories carry weight because they come from survival. Thank you for walking with me to the end of this journey. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done if you were pushed 15 miles into the Pacific by someone you raised? I genuinely want to hear your perspective. If this family revenge story moved, you consider subscribing so you don't miss our next chapter. A gentle reminder, while inspired by themes of family and justice, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling impact. If this isn't your style, feel free to explore other content that speaks to you.